Welcome to Dark Horror Diaries, my friend. Before the show starts, do write below where are you from. Let's go. It was just the two of us now. My mother, Elaine, and me, Jordan. We moved to a small house on the outskirts of town, a place no one ever seemed to talk about. The kind of place where people disappeared into the woods, and you only saw the occasional car pass by. We needed the fresh start. After Dad left, I could see the strain on her. She was tired, worn down by life and the weight of raising me alone. But I could tell, even from the moment we arrived, that something about this house felt off. The house was old, tucked between overgrown trees that made it hard to tell if it was part of the forest or if the forest had simply claimed it. The front door creaked when I opened it, and the walls smelled of something faintly musty, as if it had been closed up for years. Mom said it was fine, that it was just old, but I wasn't so sure. It felt like the kind of house that had too many secrets hidden in the cracks. At first, things seemed normal. The silence was overwhelming, but we got used to it. I unpacked my things, made my room upstairs, and tried to settle in. Mom was preoccupied with work and fixing up the house, but I noticed things. Little things. Nothing major, at least not at first. A door that was locked when you was sure I hadn't locked it. A glass that had been moved from one counter to another, though I hadn't touched it. And then there were the noises. Soft footsteps at night, almost like a shuffle, but when I went to check, the house was empty. "Mom," I said one evening after hearing a faint knock on the wall. "Did you hear that?" She glanced up from the kitchen counter. "It's just the house settling, Jordan. You know how these old places are." But I wasn't so sure. The house never felt like it was settling. It felt aware, like something was watching us, lurking just beyond the shadows, waiting for the right moment to reveal itself. I didn't tell Mom, though. She had enough to deal with. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. That's when I decided to do something I hadn't considered before. I set up a camera. A tiny one, hidden in the corner of the living room, just behind a bookshelf. I figured if nothing was going on, then I could just prove to myself that I was being paranoid. But when I checked the footage, my heart dropped. In the middle of the night, an old man crept into our house. His movements were slow, deliberate, as if he knew the house better than I did. He was thin, his clothes ragged, and his eyes. Those eyes. They gleamed with something dark, something predatory. He moved silently through the house, his gaze always fixed on the sleeping form of my mother. I could barely breathe as I watched him, inching closer to her while she lay unaware. I couldn't stop watching the footage. Over and over, I replayed the scene of the old man sneaking into our house. I had to be sure it was real. Maybe it was some kind of prank, maybe I had imagined it, but the footage didn't lie. He was there. I had no idea who he was or why he was coming into our house. I couldn't tell Mom. Not yet. She was already stretched too thin, and this would make her feel like she was losing control. I couldn't do that to her. I spent the next few days watching the cameras feed late at night, waiting for the man to return. And he did. Every night, like clockwork, he came. He would slip in, sometimes just standing in the doorway, watching us sleep for hours before moving deeper into the house. Once he even sat in the living room chair, staring at the walls for what felt like an eternity, his face locked in a blank expression. I couldn't figure out why he was there or what he wanted. The worst part was that I didn't think he even knew I was watching. It felt like he was so focused on Mom, so intent on making sure she was safe. Or maybe it was something darker. I had to find out more, so I started digging. I asked around the neighborhood, but no one seemed to know anything about the house or the old man. It was like they all pretended it didn't exist. But then, one night, I overheard a conversation at the gas station. A local was talking to another man about the house, about its previous owner. "He was a strange one," the man said, his voice low. "Never left the house, always locked himself in. He built tunnels under the place, you know." Tunnels? I froze. I had never heard anything about tunnels before. Could that explain the old man slipping in and out without being noticed? My mind raced. It made sense in a way. The house had always felt like it was hiding something, like there was more to it than just walls and floors. But what was he doing down there? What did he want with us? The next night, I decided to take matters into my own hands. I grabbed a flashlight and set out to explore the house. I started in the basement, but found nothing unusual, just old crates and tools, remnants of the last tenants' failed attempts at home improvement. I checked under the floorboards, in the attic, and even behind the walls, but it wasn't until I found a loose panel in the back of the closet that I realized how much of the house was hidden beneath its surface. There, beneath the panel, was the entrance to the tunnels. The moment I opened the panel, a cold gust of air rushed up from the darkened tunnel below. My heart pounded in my chest, but I didn't hesitate. I had to know. I had to find out what was really going on, what this old man wanted, and why he was haunting our home. The tunnel smelled musty, like mildew and decay, and it seemed to stretch endlessly into the blackness. I shone my flashlight ahead, but the beam barely cut through the darkness. The walls were lined with what looked like old, crumbling brick, some sections collapsing as though they had been abandoned for years. I took a deep breath and stepped down into the tunnel. The air was thick, heavy, and there was an eerie silence, broken only by the sound of my own footsteps. As I moved deeper, I could see small passages branching off into different directions. It felt like a maze, unnerving, disorienting. I had no idea where I was going, but I followed the narrow passageway that seemed to lead the farthest. Eventually, I came to a room. It wasn't much. A small, stone-walled space with a low ceiling, just big enough to feel suffocating. But what caught my attention wasn't the room itself. It was what was in the center of it. A worn wooden chair sat alone, facing the corner, and scattered around it were scraps of old newspaper and faded photographs. The photographs were strange, mostly of the house, but there were faces too, faces of people I didn't recognize, some of them worn and distorted, as if time had erased their identities. As I moved closer, I felt the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. My breath hitched when I noticed something that had been scribbled on the wall in what looked like chalk. "I keep it safe," it said in jagged, frantic writing. I couldn't understand it at first. But the longer I stood there, the more it began to make sense. The old man. He wasn't just sneaking around the house for no reason. He was guarding something, protecting something. But what? I retraced my steps, backtracking through the tunnels to the house. The air felt thicker now, like the walls were closing in around me, pressing in on my thoughts. I had to tell Mom. But when I reached the living room and found her sitting on the couch, her eyes wide with concern, something shifted in me. I could see it in her face. She knew something was wrong. She just didn't know what. "I've been hearing things," she said quietly. "I keep hearing whispers, at night, in the walls." I froze, the blood draining from my face. "Whispers?" She nodded. "I don't know. It's like someone's trying to tell me something, but I can't understand it." Before I could respond, the front door creaked open. And standing there, in the doorway, was the old man. I couldn't move. Time seemed to stretch, the air growing thick and heavy as the old man stood in the doorway, his dark eyes fixed on us. His clothes were ragged, his face gaunt, and yet there was something about him that felt familiar. I wanted to scream, to run, but my feet felt like they were glued to the floor. The only sound in the room was the soft creak of the door, and my heart hammering in my chest. "Who are you?" I finally managed to ask, my voice shaky, betraying my fear. The old man didn't respond at first. He just stood there, like a shadow, watching us. His gaze lingered on my mother for a moment longer than on me, and I saw her flinch, as though she recognized him from somewhere. She didn't say anything either, her lips pressed together tightly, her hands gripping the arm of the couch like she was trying to hold herself together. "You don't belong here," the man said, his voice gravelly, like he hadn't used it in years. "This is my house. You don't belong here." His words made no sense. What did he mean it was his house? We had just moved in. This house belonged to us now. I felt a surge of anger, but it quickly fizzled out when I saw how unhinged he looked. His eyes were wide, his body trembling, as if he was afraid of something. Or maybe he was trying to make us afraid. "Why are you here?" I demanded, my voice louder now, trying to keep control. "What do you want?" The old man took a step forward, his foot dragging across the floor like he was struggling to move. His eyes never left my mother. "I keep it safe," he muttered, the words coming out in a breathless whisper. "I keep it safe. I have to keep it safe." His eyes flickered to me for a brief moment, and then he turned, as though he had decided we weren't worth the trouble anymore. He started toward the hallway, moving with an unnatural slowness, like he was unsure of every step he took. And just as quickly as he had appeared, he was gone, disappearing into the shadows of the house. My mother and I just stood there, staring at the empty doorway, both of us too shaken to speak. It was clear now. The man wasn't just a stranger. He had lived here. He had been here, in the dark corners of this house, for years. The tunnels beneath our feet, the whispers in the walls, it was all connected to him. He wasn't just watching us. He was guarding us. I could feel the weight of the house pressing down on me, and I knew then that I had to do something. I couldn't just let this continue. This wasn't just about me anymore. This was about my mother, and whatever he was protecting, whatever he thought he had to keep safe. We were caught in the middle of it. That night, I didn't sleep. I couldn't. Every creak, every shift in the house made me jump. I was waiting for him to return. I didn't know what would happen when he did, but I wasn't about to let him have control over us any longer. The next morning, my mother was gone. I woke up to silence. The kind of silence that makes you feel like something is wrong, but you can't quite place your finger on it. I sat up in bed, my eyes scanning the room, but my mother's side of the bed was empty. It wasn't unusual for her to get up early. She was always the first one awake, making coffee and getting ready for work. But today felt different. I waited, listened for the sound of her moving around the house, but there was nothing. Only the quiet. I called out to her, "Mom," no response. My heart started racing. I got up and checked the kitchen, the living room, the bathroom. She wasn't anywhere. I searched every room of the house, moving quickly, but there was no sign of her. The house felt unnaturally still, like it was holding its breath, and I felt it too. The unease from the night before had grown into something darker, something suffocating. I ran outside, hoping she was just out for a walk, maybe doing something to clear her head. But the yard was empty. The wind rustled through the trees, the same trees that bordered our property, but there was no sign of her. That's when I remembered him. The old man. He had taken her, I was sure of it. He was the only one who could have done this. But why? What did he want with her? Was she just another part of his twisted obsession with keeping things safe? I raced back inside, my mind reeling. The house felt like a trap, its walls closing in around me. My only option was to go back to the tunnels. I had to find her. If he had taken her, the tunnels would be the only place he could have hidden her. I grabbed a flashlight and headed down into the basement, determined to find whatever twisted little corner of this house she was in. I crawled through the tunnels, my mind racing as I moved deeper. The air grew colder, more suffocating with each step. The walls pressed in on me, and I had to fight the panic rising in my chest. The house had never felt like this before. Every creak of the floorboards above, every slight shift in the earth beneath my feet, it all felt so alive. I wasn't sure how long I had been walking, but when I finally turned a corner, I saw a light ahead. I pushed forward, my heart pounding in my throat, until I reached the source of the light. And there, in the center of a small, dimly lit room, was my mother. She was tied to a chair, her face pale and drawn. Her eyes were wide, terrified, and when she saw me, she gasped, her lips trembling. "Jordan, you have to leave," she whispered. "You don't know what he's capable of." Before I could respond, I heard a noise from behind me. I turned just as the old man stepped into the room, his eyes filled with something wild. "You shouldn't have come," he rasped, his voice low, filled with venom. The old man's presence filled the room, suffocating me with his sheer, unnatural energy. His eyes locked onto mine with a gaze so intense that it felt like he was trying to crawl into my very soul. His body was frail, but there was an underlying madness that made him seem more dangerous than any strength could convey. I could see it now. He wasn't just protecting the house. He was protecting himself, protecting his delusions. "You shouldn't be here," he muttered, stepping closer, his hand shaking as it reached for something hidden in the folds of his tattered coat. His fingers curled around a sharp object, something long and thin that gleamed in the dim light. "I keep it safe. It's mine. All of it." "Stop," I shouted, stepping forward, but my voice cracked under the weight of my fear. "What do you want with her? What do you want with us?" The old man's face contorted, his expression twisting with a mix of confusion and anger. "It's not for you to understand. She's the one who brought you here. She's the one who invited you." He spat the last word, his lips trembling with a kind of bitter disgust. I could see the panic rising in my mother's eyes. She was terrified, not just of him, but of what he represented. I didn't know what history there was between them, but I knew it was deep, rooted in this house, this cursed place, and I had to get her out. Without thinking, I lunged for the old man, knocking the sharp object from his hand before he could strike. He let out a shriek of rage, his thin body staggering backward, but his wild eyes never left me. His hands grasped at the air, clawing for something to hold on to, but I shoved him hard, knocking him to the floor. He landed with a sickening thud, but he didn't stop. He scrambled to his feet, his face a twisted mask of desperation. "I'll keep it safe," he screamed, but his voice had lost its power. His words now seemed hollow, as though he wasn't speaking to me, but to something far beyond this room, something that had long since broken his mind. I turned back to my mother, who was still bound to the chair, her eyes pleading. "Mom, I'm getting you out of here." I grabbed the ropes that held her in place, pulling them apart with frantic urgency. The old man tried to move, but his frail body was slow, and he was disoriented, his focus splintering. I pulled my mother into my arms just as she staggered to her feet, and together we made for the door. We didn't look back. As we emerged from the tunnel, the house felt different. The air, heavy with decades of secrets and madness, seemed to lose its grip on us. The trees outside, once so looming and threatening, now appeared as they should, quiet and unassuming. We made it to the front yard, and it was only then that I realized how close we had come to losing everything. The sirens wailed in the distance, growing louder as they neared the house. I turned, watching the flashing lights approach, knowing that the nightmare wasn't over, but at least now we were free. The old man was left behind, but I knew he wouldn't be the last thing to haunt this place. The police arrived, swarming into the house, but by then, the old man was gone. They found the tunnels, the photographs, and the frantic scribblings on the walls, but they never found him. He was a ghost now, just like the house itself. Forever tied to the shadows, never truly gone. My mother and I left the town soon after, unable to shake the weight of what had happened. The house was abandoned, left to rot, and I knew we would never look back. The old man had kept it safe for so long, but in the end, it was nothing but a trap. A place where lost souls were kept hidden, locked away in the darkness. And now it was free, but so were we. I, 33 male, live in Texas with my daughter, Alicia 8F, and my son Jay 4M. Their mom has been out of the picture for the past 2 years, not dead, just a piece of shit, and I've managed pretty well as a single father. The three of us lived in a 2-bedroom in a nice neighborhood. I've got a solid job, and the kids are thankfully healthy. Everything was smooth sailing until one night, 2 months ago, during which I was awoken by Jay poking me in the face. He was sobbing violently, though I recognized it as the "I'm afraid" kind of crying as opposed to the "I'm hurt" kind of crying, which made me a little less worried. Jay's always been nightmare-prone, so I assumed that's what was causing him distress. When I asked him what was wrong, though, he said, "The man in the next house is making scary faces at me." I'd heard my fair share of Jay's stories about monsters terrorizing him from the dark corners of his bedroom, but this was something new. I assumed he meant our neighbor's house, and the lack of fantastical elements in his description made me uneasy. It felt too specific to be one of his usual nightmares. I got out of bed and walked with Jay in tow to my kids' room. Alicia was awake in the top bunk. From the soft glow of their nightlight, I could see her crossing her arms and scowling down at her little brother. I didn't turn on any lights to give myself a better view of the outdoors and peered out the bedroom window. Their window had curtains on it, but for once they hadn't been drawn all the way, and there was a small opening between them through which Jay must have looked out. One side of the neighbor's house, the one to our left from the street, was visible from Alicia and Jay's room. There were 2 windows on the neighbor's side of the house, but it was too dark inside to see anything. I recalled from what I'd seen in the daylight that the window on the left, the one closest to the front of the house, was the kitchen. I wasn't sure what the window on the right was, as it always had its curtains drawn. I asked Alicia if she'd seen anything, and she shook her head. "He's always having nightmares and crying. I don't want to share a room with him anymore, Dad. I never get any sleep. It's not fair." Of course, hearing that made Jay start crying again, so I let him sleep in my room for the night. He has this TMNT indoor camping tent that he prefers to his actual bed. Honestly, at that point, I half suspected his nightmare to be a ploy to get me to let him camp. Anyway, I guess I'm a total pushover because he slept in that tent in my room for the next 2 nights. On the 3rd night, I was again woken up, but this time by Alicia, who was standing over me and shaking my arm. That kid hadn't woken me up in the middle of the night for years. When I asked her what was wrong, she said, "The neighbor was making faces at me." Those words, and the fear in my daughter's voice, really put me on edge. I closed the curtains when I said goodnight. "Did you open them?" "Only a little, but it's 'cause I heard a weird noise." "What did you hear?" Alicia couldn't recall exactly. According to her, she had gotten out of bed to see what was going on, and when she lifted the curtain, she saw a light on in the neighbor's window. The curtains in the back room had been drawn back, and our neighbor was standing in his house, right up against the window frame. What was he doing? Alicia thought for a moment, and then made an expression I never want to see on my child's face, or anyone else's for that matter, ever again. I won't do it justice by describing it, but it looked something like this. First she smiled with both sets of teeth, so that there was a little open sliver between the rows, and then she furrowed her eyebrows. She inclined her head towards me, kind of Kubrick stare-esque, and strained the muscles in her neck. The worst part, though, was what she did with her hands. She held out her left arm, forearm up. Then she clenched her right hand into a fist and moved it back and forth rapidly over her forearm. Poor thing described it as playing the violin, but it seemed pretty obvious to me that my neighbor was pantomiming cutting. Disturbed, I told Alicia to stop, and to not make either the expression or the gesture again. I was angry and confused. My neighbor, a man in his 40s, was a bit of a recluse, but he had seemed normal enough in the 3 or 4 times I'd spoken to him. I couldn't fathom why he would do something like that to my kids. After asking Alicia a few more questions, I realized that my neighbor might not have done anything technically, or at least legally wrong. It wasn't against the law to make inappropriate gestures in your own home, but it seemed like he was targeting my kids specifically. Legal or not, I planned to have a little chat with him the following morning. My last question to Alicia was if our neighbor had made any other gestures, and she nodded. Then she started making beckoning, come here motions with both of her hands. I had Alicia sleep in my room for the night as well. I also checked out the window in my kids' room, but like before, I saw nothing. The house was completely dark. The next morning, before work, and after dropping Alicia and Jay off to school, I spent a good 5 minutes knocking on my neighbor's front door. I figured he was home since his car was in the driveway, but he never answered the door. Eventually, I had to leave for work, and as I was walking away, I turned around quickly to see if he was watching me. He was, the coward. I saw him for a split second at the front window before he ducked beneath the sill and out of view. Clearly, the guy had problems. I yelled out to him to stop messing with us and then left. That same night, I put a plan in motion. While my kids slept in my room, I hung out in theirs. It was a Friday night, and I was ready to pull an all-nighter so that I could catch my neighbor in the act. Although I trusted my kids, I wanted to confirm that there was actually something nefarious going on before I escalated things. I made sure the house was locked up and all the curtains drawn, tucked my kids in, and sat on the floor under the window in their room. At around 9, I started marathoning midnight mass on my phone. I didn't want to wear headphones and miss any strange sounds, so I kept the volume low and mostly read subtitles. At midnight, I started to hear strange sounds. Like Alicia said, it's a bit hard to describe. Best I can do is that it was this low, repeated clicking sound. You know the CHK sound you make to beckon a horse? It was something like that. All I knew is that the sound was undoubtedly coming from a person. After a few minutes of this, the sound switched to what I think was supposed to be a whistle, but it came out all wrong, like someone sucking breath in through their teeth. The sound was so crisp that the neighbor's window must have been open, which was an unsettling thought given that there was only around 15 feet of space between our houses. Certain that the neighbor was at his window, and that this was my best chance to see him, I stood up and pulled the curtain back in one motion. I saw him right away. There was a dim light on in his room, allowing me to see that horrible expression Alicia had made the night prior. It was one thing to see my child's recreation, but it was far more frightening on an adult. His window was indeed open, and his arms were stuck out into the cold night, violently swiping against each other in a grotesque mimicry of self-harm. When he saw me, and realized that he was looking at another grown man, and not some poor child, he stopped his erratic motions. His cartoonish grin faded and another, more genuine emotion settled over his features. Rage. The man grabbed the window and slammed it shut, then closed the curtains with the same forcefulness. I let my own curtain fall. I was a little shell-shocked, I think. Of course, I was perturbed by the sight of the man, by his face and his movement, and the fact that he'd been doing that for who knows how many nights now in an attempt to frighten my kids. However, another detail stuck out as even more concerning to me, which was the fact that I genuinely wasn't sure if the man I had just seen was my neighbor. I'd seen him so few times in the years I'd lived in that house, and I was having trouble conjuring up his face. I sat on the floor for a minute, my blood thundering in my ears. I definitely had enough evidence at that point to call the cops, right? Just as I was about to pull out my phone, I heard a tremendous smack against the glass of the bedroom window. After a brief hesitation, I pulled the curtain back again. There were no lights on in the neighbor's house, and there was also no one outside from what I could see. I pulled the curtains back a little further and saw a handprint in the top corner of the window pane. It's worth noting that our house is on a raised foundation, and that particular window is very tall, so even though the window is on the first floor, the man outside would have needed an insane vertical to get his hand up there. I pulled out my phone and dialed 911. As I explained the situation to them, I quickly walked around the house to see if I could catch a glimpse of the man. My last stop was my bedroom. Once inside, I locked the doors, and while still on the phone with the operator, I took my handgun out of the safe in my closet. My heart was beating out of my chest, but I knew I had to stay calm, even more so when I saw that Alicia was awake and looking out of the tent at me. I reassured her in as few words as I could, whispering that we were okay, but we had to stay very quiet. I sat on the edge of my bed, my firearm ready and my ears straining. My kid's tent was in the corner, and to the left of the tent, in the middle of the wall and directly across from where I sat, was a window. After what felt like an eternity, I saw something. It was a cloudless night, and the moonlight was bright enough that I could see a silhouette through the white curtains. The dark shape was nebulous at first, but became more clear as the man outside stepped closer to the window. Somehow, he knew which room we were in. The silhouette didn't move for several minutes, and I remember being thankful that, from the angle at which she sat, Alicia couldn't see it. Then, something happened that I couldn't entirely wrap my head around. The man stepped back from the glass and raised his arms, making a Y shape with his body and his limbs. Only, his arms were far too long. They seemed to be double the length that they should have been, each arm about the same length as his entire body. I thought at first that he was holding something, maybe two pipes that just appeared to be an extension of his limbs, but I could clearly see two hands at the ends of the extremities. I could see 5 fingers on each hand, flopping around slightly as the man brought his arms closer to the window. Thud, thud, thud. I stood up and readied myself to shoot, but just then the sounds of sirens pierced the quiet night. The man outside banged his hands against the window one last time, and then it was as if someone had sliced his arms at the elbows. His forearms seemed to shear right off, and the man took off running before they so much as hit the ground. When the police officers announced themselves, I answered the door and explained the situation to them. 2 officers, a man and a woman, asked me a few questions about my neighbor, which I assume was necessary to establish probable cause for a search. Once finished, they told me to stay inside with the doors locked while they investigated the neighbor's house. I watched them through the window of Alicia and Jay's room. They knocked on the neighbor's door, and when no one answered, they tried the front door handle. I watched the unlocked door swing open. The two looked at one another and then entered. I'm not sure what they found inside that house. All I know is that when they emerged a few moments later, they both looked very disturbed. When I went outside to ask what they had found, the female officer told me simply, "Your neighbor's dead." The rest of the night was a blur of strangers in uniforms filing in and out of my neighbor's home. Some came to my porch afterwards to ask me questions, and none offered me any answers. They moved with tight-lipped efficiency, their faces guarded, their words clipped. At one point, I wandered to the side of the house and found several people photographing something on the ground outside my bedroom window. Before they could ask me to leave, I made out the gruesome shape of two human arms. The kids and I have been staying in my parents' apartment for months, and I think everyone, even Jay, is getting tired of the cramped living situation. We can't stay in the house. Alicia is way too traumatized for that, and I wouldn't be comfortable staying there while the murderer is still at large anyway. I want to sell the house, but our story going semi-viral is making that difficult. After all, who would want a house that, thanks to the news, has become permanently associated with phrases like dismemberment and days of torture and victim barely recognizable as human? The house was an unexpected find, a bit too far out of town, with the nearest neighbor miles away, but it had an undeniable charm. Mark and I hadn't planned on buying an old house, not like this one, but sometimes life throws you a curvy ball, and you swing without thinking. We'd been searching for something affordable, anything that would let us settle down, create roots away from the chaos of the city. The price seemed too good to pass up. Mark was practical, always thinking about the future. He'd been excited from the moment we laid eyes on the place, trying to convince me with that grin of his, the one that could talk me into anything. "It's perfect, Em. Just needs a little work," he'd said, stepping through the overgrown yard, his boots crunching over the dry, dead grass. I tried to smile, but something about the place felt off. The house loomed in the distance, old and neglected, its windows darkened by years of dust and dirt. There was a feeling in the air, something heavier than the typical country silence. But it was cheap, and we were in no position to be picky. It has potential, I told myself, more than anyone else, as we stepped inside. The floors creaked beneath us, the walls sagging slightly, like the house was exhaling a tired, drawn-out breath. I could almost hear its secrets. Mark, ever the optimist, went straight for the living room. "This place has good bones," he said. He didn't seem to notice the faint smell of mildew that hung in the air. "Just needs some elbow grease, a fresh coat of paint." We both knew it needed more than that, but we didn't talk about it. We couldn't afford to, not really, so we moved in. There was a strange comfort in it at first, the quiet, the isolation, the way everything felt ours. Sure, the floorboards were scratched, and there was a smell in the walls that didn't quite make sense, but we brushed it off. Old houses had their quirks. As the days passed, I began to notice little things. A door would be slightly ajar when we were sure we had closed it. A faint scrape against the walls like something, or someone, was moving behind them. I chalked it up to nerves. Mark didn't notice, or if he did, he wasn't concerned. "It's just the house settling," he'd say, that ever-present optimism that made me feel like I was the crazy one. But even I couldn't ignore the sense of being watched, of something lurking in the corners of our new life. It wasn't until the third week that I found the jars. I'd been cleaning out the basement when my fingers brushed against something cool, smooth, and foreign beneath the dust. I knelt down, wiping away layers of grime, and found a small collection of glass jars stacked in the corner, hidden behind boxes. I thought at first they were old preserves, something left behind by the previous owners. But when I opened one, I was hit with a rancid odor. Inside the jar were remains. Fingers, skin, flesh, but not human flesh. There was no mistaking it now. I stumbled back, my heart hammering in my chest. The smell was unbearable, but the realization of what I had just found was far worse. My breath caught in my throat as I stumbled backwards, trying to regain some composure. The basement felt colder suddenly, as though the temperature had dropped several degrees in a matter of seconds. The jars seemed to mock me, sitting innocently in the shadows, as if waiting for me to open them to discover their contents. I should have screamed, should have run upstairs and told Mark, but my feet were frozen to the spot. The unease in my stomach twisted tighter with every passing second. I could still hear Mark upstairs, humming as he worked on something in the kitchen. He didn't hear me, didn't hear the sudden shift in the air that sent a shiver crawling up my spine. The world felt wrong in a way I couldn't articulate, but I was starting to realize I wasn't alone down here. Not truly. I hadn't been since the day we moved in. I had dismissed the small things, the noises, the lingering shadows. But now, in the silence of the basement, those things all seemed to make sense. I had to tell Mark, but the thought of bringing him down here, showing him what I had found, felt wrong. What if it wasn't real? What if I was just imagining it? What if I was starting to crack under the strain of living in this house? But I knew this was more than just my imagination. The remains in the jars were real. Human remains. Trembling, I gathered the jars, trying to make sense of the grotesque collection. Some of the glass was cracked, others completely intact, but all of them contained parts that made my stomach turn. Fingers, toes, a single human ear. A shiver ran through me as I realized the man, or woman, who had left these behind had been meticulous, collecting pieces over time, preserving them like some kind of twisted art. I couldn't bring myself to look at them any longer, but I couldn't seem to stop my hands from holding them, trembling and shaking. The thought of Mark being involved in this, even unknowingly, made me sick to my stomach. He had no idea what was going on. He was upstairs, happy, working on a meal. I didn't want to ruin it. I didn't want to make him see what I had found, not yet. Maybe there was an explanation. Maybe I was overreacting, imagining the worst when there was a simpler solution. But the longer I stood there, the more I realized that something was wrong with this house, with the man who had lived here before us. Someone had been watching us. Someone had been waiting. I forced myself to put the jars back in their hiding spot, pushing them far enough under the old wooden floorboards so they couldn't be seen. My hands shook uncontrollably as I did, as though I could hide the truth by simply pretending it wasn't there. When I stood up, the basement seemed to close in around me, the walls pressing tighter with every breath. Something was wrong, something so deeply wrong, but I couldn't bring myself to face it. I heard Mark calling down from the stairs, his voice cutting through the thick silence. "Em, you okay down there?" I couldn't bring myself to answer him right away. Not yet. I stood frozen in the basement, the faint smell of decay still hanging in the air. Mark's voice called down again, a little louder this time, tinged with concern. "Em, what's going on?" I forced a smile to my lips as I turned towards the stairs, trying to sound normal, to mask the fear curling in my gut. "I'm fine," I called back. My voice didn't sound like my own, strained, distant. But I pushed the feeling aside and took a deep breath, climbing the stairs one by one, as though each step was a small victory. Mark was standing in the doorway when I reached the top, his brows furrowed, lips pressed together in that familiar way he did when something was off. "You've been down there for a while. What's going on?" I hesitated. The truth was a heavy thing, a burden I wasn't ready to carry alone. I found something. I couldn't look at him, afraid he'd see the panic in my eyes. "It's nothing," I added quickly, dismissing the weight of it all. "Just something weird. I'll take care of it." Mark stepped forward, touching my arm gently. "Em, you're not okay. Talk to me. Whatever it is, we'll figure it out together." I wanted to tell him. I really did. But the words felt like they were stuck in my throat, a lump of fear I couldn't swallow. How could I explain that the house was haunted by something that wasn't just the creaks of old wood and the wind outside? How could I tell him that the darkness here wasn't just in the walls, but in the very air we were breathing? Instead, I shook my head. "I just need some air. I'll be fine. Let's get some dinner, okay?" He hesitated, as if trying to decide whether to push me further. but he must have seen something in my eyes because he sighed and gave a reluctant nod. "Okay, but we're talking about this later, Em. I'm not letting this go." I nodded, grateful he didn't press further, but the weight of his words followed me as we moved into the kitchen. Dinner was a quiet affair, the tension hanging between us like a heavy fog. I couldn't focus on anything, couldn't stop thinking about what I'd found. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the jars, the fragments of human flesh, the twisted remnants of someone's life. Mark tried to make small talk, asking about my day, about work, but I barely heard him. My mind kept drifting back to that basement, to the feeling that we weren't alone in this house. The longer we stayed here, the more I felt like we were being watched, like the house itself was alive. Its walls breathing, its floorboards groaning in warning. After dinner, I insisted on cleaning up, wanting to keep my hands busy, to keep my mind occupied. Mark offered to help, but I waved him off, insisting I needed some time alone. He left the room, and for the first time since we'd moved in, I was left alone in the silence of the house. The house didn't feel quiet, though. It felt full of eyes, full of whispers. The basement door was closed, but I knew it wouldn't stay that way for long. The next few days passed in a haze of uncertainty. I kept busy, tried to convince myself I was being paranoid, that the house was just settling like Mark said. But the scratches on the floorboards seemed to deepen, and the smell, God, the smell, never quite left. It clung to the walls, in the corners, in the air I breathed, even in my dreams. It was as if the house was trying to tell me something I wasn't ready to hear. Mark continued to be oblivious, or maybe he was just too wrapped up in his own world to notice the subtle changes. He was busy with his job, working long hours, and I was left alone to deal with whatever haunted this place. I should have told him, should have opened up and told him what I found in the basement, but every time I thought about it, my heart would race, my thoughts tangled. What if he didn't believe me? What if he thought I was losing my mind? The last thing I wanted was for him to think I was crazy. Still, something was wrong. I could feel it in my bones. One night, as Mark worked late, I couldn't stand it anymore. The house felt suffocating, like the walls were closing in. I needed to know what was going on. Needed to confront whatever it was lurking in the shadows. I grabbed a flashlight from the kitchen drawer, my hands shaking as I turned it on. The beam cut through the dark, illuminating the creaky steps that led to the basement door. The air around me felt thick, the silence oppressive, but I forced myself to walk forward. As my hand touched the cold, brass handle of the basement door, I hesitated. It was like something was holding me back, a voice in my head telling me to stop, to leave it alone. But I couldn't. Not anymore. Not after what I had found. The need for answers outweighed the fear. The door creaked open, and the cold hit me like a slap in the face. I stepped down into the basement, my flashlight trembling in my grip. The walls felt closer down here, the darkness pressing in. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched again, that someone, or something, was lurking just out of sight. I focused on the spot where I'd hidden the jars, my heart pounding in my chest. But when I reached the corner, the jars were gone. My breath hitched in my throat. I searched the entire basement, my flashlight flicking over every inch of the room, but there was nothing. The jars were gone. I stood frozen for a long moment, panic rising in my chest. How could they be gone? I hadn't imagined it. I hadn't imagined any of it. But there was no sign of them. No sign of anything, except for the feeling that I was no longer alone. "Mark," I whispered under my breath, but the sound was swallowed by the suffocating silence. I spun around, shining the flashlight toward the stairs, but when I turned back, I froze. There, standing in the shadows at the far end of the basement, was a figure. His face was obscured by the darkness, but I could make out the outline of him, tall, thin, and moving with a slow, deliberate purpose. I didn't move. I couldn't. The figure took a step forward, and my pulse thundered in my ears. "Emily." The voice was low, familiar, like a whisper from the deepest recesses of my mind. It wasn't Mark. The figure didn't move again, but the sound of his voice echoed through the basement, sending a chill racing down my spine. My heart hammered in my chest, my breath shallow as I backed away slowly, trying not to make a sound. But my legs felt like jelly, like they might give out at any moment. The basement seemed to stretch, the walls closing in on me, the air thick with a stench of something rotten. I couldn't look away from him, couldn't tear my gaze from the shadows where his outline stood, half-formed and barely real. "Emily," the voice repeated, softer this time, almost a whisper. I should have run. I should have turned and bolted up the stairs, but something in me, some primal part, held me rooted to the spot. I knew this wasn't a dream. This wasn't a trick of the light. I wasn't imagining it. Whatever this was, whatever I was facing, it was real. "Who are you?" I managed to croak, the words barely escaping my throat. My hand gripped the flashlight so tightly I thought it might snap in my hands. But I didn't care. I needed to know. I needed to understand. The figure stepped closer, and the faint light from the flashlight reflected off something in his hands. Something glistening. My stomach turned. I didn't want to look, but I couldn't look away. As he moved into the dim light, his face became clearer, and the horror sank in. He wasn't a stranger. He wasn't some figure from the shadows. I knew him. It was the previous owner of the house, the man who had killed and collected parts. He wasn't dead. He was standing right there in front of me, and he was smiling. "You didn't think I'd let you just leave, did you?" His voice was low, steady, cold. "I've been watching you, Emily. Watching you both." I felt a rush of nausea, a wave of dizziness. My head spun, and I thought I might pass out. But I couldn't. Not with him here, not with this man standing in front of me, the man who had collected pieces of lives, who had watched us, waited for this moment. "Mark," I whispered, panicking. "Where is he?" The figure chuckled, a sound that made my skin crawl. "Your precious fiancé is upstairs, unaware of what's been happening here. He doesn't know, but he will soon enough. I've made sure of that." I felt the blood drain from my face as I took another step back, the cold of the basement now suffocating. My mind raced. I had to get to Mark. I had to warn him. But my body refused to cooperate, too frozen by fear, too paralyzed by the realization that this man, this killer, was still alive, still lurking in the shadows of our home. With a sickening slowness, the figure took another step toward me, his eyes glinting with something dark and twisted. He was toying with me. "You should have left when you had the chance, Emily. You should have known better than to move into my house." I turned, desperate, my legs shaking as I sprinted for the stairs. But as I reached the first step, I heard it. A loud crash from upstairs, followed by the sound of Mark shouting my name, his voice strained, full of fear. "Emily!" I didn't stop. I didn't look back. I bolted up the stairs, my feet barely touching the steps as I sprinted toward the living room. My mind was screaming, but my body was moving on instinct, driven by nothing but panic and the need to get to Mark before it was too late. The house was eerily quiet now, but I could still hear his voice, faint but desperate. The crash had come from the kitchen. I didn't have time to think about the horrors in the basement, or the man who had been watching us for days. I had to save him. When I reached the kitchen, I froze in the doorway. Mark was there, struggling against a figure who stood in the middle of the room. The man from the basement. His face was twisted into a sickening grin, his hands gripping Mark's arms tightly as he shoved him toward the counter. "Mark!" I screamed, but the words barely made it past my lips before the man turned toward me, his eyes gleaming with malice. "You should have stayed out of it," he said, his voice thick with satisfaction. "But now, you've seen too much. Now, there's no turning back." I had to act. I couldn't stand there and watch him hurt Mark. I couldn't let him finish what he had started. My eyes darted around the room, searching for something, anything to use as a weapon. And then my gaze landed on the shovel in the corner by the door. Without thinking, I ran toward it, grabbed the handle with both hands, and swung it toward the man with all the strength I could muster. The shovel struck him across the back, and he let out a strangled gasp, stumbling forward. I didn't stop. I swung again, the metal of the shovel connecting with his skull, knocking him to the ground. His grip on Mark loosened, and I pulled him away from the man's crumpled body, dragging him toward the door. "Emily, what's happening?" Mark gasped, his face pale, blood dripping from a cut on his cheek. "Who the hell is that?" "There's no time to explain," I said, my voice trembling with the weight of everything that had happened. "We need to get out of here now." I yanked him toward the front door, but as we reached it, I heard the man stir behind us, groaning in pain. He wasn't done. I glanced over my shoulder, my heart pounding, but Mark was already pulling me outside, into the night air, away from the house and the nightmare within. We ran. We didn't look back. The police arrived shortly after, drawn by the sound of our frantic screams. I stood on the porch, breathless, watching as they entered the house. It wasn't long before they came out again, hauling the man, our attacker, out in handcuffs. He was unconscious, his face bruised, but still alive. I didn't care. It was over. The nightmare was over. Later, the police would tell us the man's name, Richard Grant. He had once lived in this house before his killing spree had come to an abrupt halt, only for him to vanish. They believed he had been using the basement as a mausoleum for years, keeping his victims' remains hidden in glass jars, just like the ones I had found. The house, they said, had been the perfect place to continue his twisted game, watching as others moved in, unsuspecting. But for me, the truth didn't matter anymore. What mattered was that we were safe. Mark was safe. The man, Grant, was no longer a threat, and the house, with its ghosts and secrets, would remain a dark memory. This year has been a rough ride for me so far. I got out of a 3-year relationship last September, and work has been very hard to focus on. Before anyone suggests this, I am talking to someone, a professional. After a lot of weed usage, many talks with my counselor, and some more legitimate medication, this summer was supposed to be my time to start pulling myself out of the hole. So I rented this house. New place, new life, new me, you know. It was a nice enough place. 1,000 square feet, 1 bed, 1.5 baths. It even had a lawn that I could see myself mowing throughout the summer months. The landlord gave me a tour before the lease was signed and finalized. The bedroom was a little small, but I wasn't looking for a lot of open space. I just wanted my little piece of the world, and this seemed like it could be it, at least for the 12-month leasing agreement. There was only one weird thing about my meager home to be. I wanted to ask more questions when it came up during the tour, but I really didn't want to scrutinize a good thing. I'm afraid I made a large mistake. Murray McDonald was a bigger, middle-aged man with a round face, but weathered hands that he tucked into the back pockets of his jeans each time our tour took a little pause for me to survey the rooms. Our conversation through most of the half an hour or so I was there that day was little more than my eager questions being met with grunts to the affirmative or negative serving as answers. Each time we came to a new spot to inspect, Murray would turn to me, hands in his back pockets, and raise his dark eyebrows, etching several furrows in his forehead as he did so. It was a tired look that let me know just how happy the man was to be answering my questions. But I asked nonetheless. I have a questioning nature. My ex said so anyways. This process was played out in the living room, the bedroom, and both bathrooms. It was simple enough. Nothing was out of the ordinary, and I was feeling excited to move in. Then we came to the kitchen, and Murray's demeanor changed entirely. As he walked in, he moved quickly past me down the narrow lane between the stove and the sink and leaned his back against the wall on the far side of the room. It was the fastest I had seen him move since the tour began. I'll be honest and tell you it spooked me a little bit, but I shook it off, reaching for the thrilled feeling I'd been reveling in. The kitchen was definitely workable. It wasn't built for a team to cook in or anything, but once again it would just be me. Everything was as clean as could be expected, and all the fixtures seemed to be in order. Satisfied, I turned with a smile to look at Murray, still leaning against the far wall. He wasn't looking at me. There were no raised eyebrows or lines of annoyance on his face. His eyes were wide and staring down at the tiled floor of the kitchen. His arms were crossed over his chest, and I spied a thin line of sweat running down his temple. The change from weary landlord to this alarmed state he seemed to be in now froze me where I stood. I stayed still and quiet for a moment that stretched over the interior of the little house like mist settling over the world. The moment passed, and I swallowed with a little effort and spoke at last. "Murray." He jumped at the sound, his wide eyes locking with mine. The intensity in that stare made me stumble back a step. At that, Murray seemed to remember why we were here, shook his head a little, and stood up a little straighter before he spoke. "Sorry about that," he grumbled amicably, lost in a thought for a minute there, I guess. "No worries," I laughed shakily. "Happens to me all the time." Not terribly convinced, I was ready to head out and leave this strange man to get lost in whatever thoughts he wanted to. I just wanted to get everything for the house settled and move forward. "Well, this all looks perfect," I said with a thin smile. "Anything else I should know about the place before I get moved in?" At this, Murray's face dropped a little. He took off his well-worn baseball cap and ran a hand through a thinning patch of dark hair beneath. Returning his gaze to me, Murray stepped away from the wall for the first time since we entered the kitchen, and I could finally see that it wasn't a wall he was standing in front of. It was a door. There wasn't anything special about its appearance. It was a simple white door. The doors in the rest of the house looked exactly the same as this one. In my mind, I thought this meant I had more closet space than I thought, or maybe even a full pantry. Feeling some of the excitement I'd carried with me through the beginning of the tour, I turned back to Murray, who was watching me closely from beside the door. Then he spoke in a calm, friendly voice, very unlike the tone he'd favored during the rest of our short conversations. "Well, technically there's one more room in the house. The basement," he said with a small nod to the door he had been leaning against. Before I could respond or react, Murray barreled on. "But I've been using the space as storage for a lot of my own crap through the years. The door stays locked, and the only key is mine. I hope you aren't offended, but I just don't want you messing around down there in all the old junk. I haven't kept it real organized, and I worry someone else might stumble and hurt themselves. You understand?" It seemed like a reasonable explanation, but my lizard brain was abuzz with the instinct to run from the house. Thoughts of crazy landlords keeping tenants as sex slaves in their secret basement dungeons played out in my mind. My poker face being shit, Murray must have seen the worry on my face. With a convincing laugh, he put his hands up in the air like he was surrendering himself. "I know what you're thinking. Who is this guy and what awful thing is going on in his basement that he doesn't want me to know about?" We both laughed a little. I didn't feel much like laughing, but it cut the tension a bit. He continued on. "I swear it's nothing like that. We can take a look if you want." He took his keys out of his back pocket and selected the necessary key. Again, he looked at me with raised eyebrows and furrowed brow, waiting for a response. After a second of hesitation and a few more murder scenarios playing in my brain, I blinked and answered the man. "Why not?" The basement was very much just a basement. A concrete floor with shelves and boxes galore. Murray hadn't lied about the abundance of junk down there. He had to climb over several piles of it to reach the solitary light bulb that hung from the ceiling at the center of the room. Satisfied, I told Murray we could head back up. Back in the kitchen, Murray closed and locked the door once again, returning his keys to his pocket. Turning to me, he spoke again with nonchalance and dismissal. "See? Nothing crazy at all. Just a lot of shit someone could trip over. So do me a favor, huh? Don't worry about getting in here. Not without me." Looking to end what was starting to feel like a very strange encounter, I nodded quickly. This apparently wouldn't suffice. Murray spoke again with harshness in his voice. "I need you to say it. You will not try to go down there without me. You will leave it be." I stared at him for a moment, not exactly trying to hide the puzzlement on my face. He raised his eyebrows at me again, but the tiredness in his eyes had been replaced with clear focus now. My blood turning to ice in that gaze, I eagerly answered, "Of course, I'll stay in my areas up here. I promise not to mess with the basement at all without you here." Murray held his cold gaze on me for another swollen moment before apparently deciding that my answer was acceptable. The tour was completed, and I hastily left the house, trying to focus on how good it would be to have my own place and a fresh start. All the while, that icy stare the older man had held me and made me jittery the entire drive home. Later that week, the papers were finalized and I had my keys. Gathering up some friends, I got moved in with relative ease, and all was right with the world. My buddies stayed over for a while once we were done to enjoy a well-deserved feast of pizza and beer. It was such a relief to just hang out and be happy in my new home, filling it up with warmth and light. As it got later, my friends began to head for home one by one. When the last one had left, I locked the front door, turned, and rested my back against it. I looked up at the house and smiled wide. "It's gonna be good," I said out loud to myself in the house. I turned towards my bedroom to hit the hay myself. 3 loud knocks came from somewhere in the house. Knock, knock, knock. Frozen in place, I perked my ears, half convinced I had imagined the sound. The silence stretched out forever, and a quiet ringing bloomed in my ears. I let out my breath, trying to replace my sense of calm with oxygen. I began to move towards my room again. Knock, knock, knock. I whipped around. My heartbeat hammered in my ears like an echo of the knocking sound. This time, it was clear where the noise was coming from: the kitchen. Painfully aware of each sound I made, I inched my way back down the hall, through the living room, and into the kitchen. I flipped the light switch and was greeted by that ominous white door on the far side of the room. It was sitting there waiting for me like it had invited me in for some coffee. In that moment, I couldn't make my feet move forward anymore, and I just stared at the door waiting for another knocking noise to come and my sanity to go. I counted the seconds, then the minutes. 5 minutes went by with me standing stock, still in my own kitchen, staring at the locked basement door. After 10 minutes, I was convinced I'd had a few too many, and was content to end the night with a few more and a night of drunken sleep. Laughing a little, I reached in the fridge and grabbed a couple more beers. I walked back to the kitchen entrance and looked back at the basement door. It still looked like it was waiting for me there. I shook the thought off and flipped the light switch off. A thin line of yellow light was leaking through the crack at the bottom of the basement door. I stared at it. There was no way it was real. Or maybe Murray had left the light on. But I hadn't seen the light before I hit the kitchen light switch walking in. It couldn't have been real. That's what I kept thinking. Reaching up, I hit the kitchen light switch again, and there was the basement door stark white and almost smiling at me. "Did you see? Are you sure you saw what you saw? Come a little closer. Take another look." My hand was shaking on the light switch now, and I could feel my eyes bulging in their sockets. Slowly, I took a deep breath and let it out with a shudder. I would turn the lights off, and there would be nothing. It was fine. I was fine. With a click, the kitchen lights went dark once more. What I saw then sent me scrambling back down the hall into my room, and I did not leave until the sun had returned the following morning. The yellow light still seeped out from under the door, broken only by the unmistakable shadow of 2 feet. Knock, knock, knock. That first night, the beers I had clutched to me as I ran down the hall were the only things that let me get any sleep at all. I woke up the next morning, squinting into the daylight leaking through my curtains, and for a minute I couldn't remember what I had been afraid of. It was like waking up from a nightmare as the details of whatever horrible thing that haunted my mind faded out in the light of day. But my brain held on to the fear. My breath came in shallow jets from my nose, and my eyes scanned the room erratically. I didn't remember the source of my anxiety until I spied the boxes of unpacked clothes and books stacked in front of my bedroom door. Once again, I couldn't shake the feeling that the door was taunting me, peeking over the wall of boxes I'd built for some semblance of peace of mind. Wanting to rid my brain of that image, I closed my eyes and dropped my head into my hands with a tired sigh. Behind my eyelids, the basement door was waiting instead, glaring white in the light of the kitchen. The image flickered to my kitchen bathed in darkness. With dread, I watched the weak yellow light flare up under the door. Again, the image changed, and there beneath the door, the shadow of feet, standing and waiting patiently, expectantly. Anyone home? I opened my eyes and was greeted with my own white bedroom door behind the boxes. A churning in my stomach threatened to bubble over, and I flopped wearily back to my pillow. I've never really been one to believe in the supernatural. Not out loud, at least. There was always that section at the back of my brain that I tried desperately to keep quiet, the what-if part of my brain. As I laid there in my bed that morning, that part of my brain was screaming, demanding answers. And so I set out to get some. The first step was to check the house. Moving the boxes was a slow process. Not that they were heavy or that there were many of them. They were relatively light, and I'd only had 4 or 5 in the room with me. But every little noise the house made in the morning quiet was some stalking, lurking thing waiting on the other side of my bedroom door, at least in my mind. Nonetheless, I cleared the path out of my bedroom, cautiously opened the door inch by inch, and peered out into the rest of the house. The hallway was dark and quiet. Everything was still in the house except for the loud ticking of the clock in the living room. Taking a deep breath, I stepped out into the hallway. The bathroom off the hallway was clear. Nothing in the living room either. Everything was in the state that I'd left it the night before. 1 or 2 empty beer bottles on the coffee table, a pizza box lazily tossed by the front door. But I checked every corner in the closet, under the couch even. Part of this was just me wanting to be thorough, but the larger part was that, what if part of my brain just looking for reasons to put off going into the kitchen? Eventually, the kitchen was all that was left to check. As I crossed the threshold from living room to kitchen, I couldn't make my eyes look up at the basement door. They were happy to scan the fridge and the cabinets for as long as could be, but the prospect of seeing that white door waiting for me again was making my head swim. But once again, at some point, all that's left to do is the thing you would do absolutely anything to avoid. I looked at the door. There it was. Just a door. It didn't stretch out at me or groan with the weight of 1,000 souls. It just sat there like it had been waiting for me to wake up. Hey there, how'd you sleep? Any dreams? I dreamed about you. I shook my head to clear the shadow puppets I was casting on the walls of my own mind. It was just a door. This was my house, and I had to grow the hell up. With the sound of my heartbeat drowning out the ticking of the living room clock, I moved slowly toward the basement door. I was standing right in front of it before I noticed I was holding my breath. As noiselessly as I could, I exhaled and took a few slow, steady gulps of air. My heart shuddered its beats in my chest, sending shock waves through my body. All the while, the door stood unmoved. I stood there for longer than I care to admit before finally reaching my hand out and trying the knob. To my trembling relief, it was securely locked. I tried a couple more times just to be sure, leaning my weight against the wood and gripping the knob tightly as I shook it. Nothing. I pressed my ear up against the door's surface and listened, holding my breath once more. 1 second ticked into 10, into 30, into a minute. Nothing. I breathed in a deep lungful of air and let it out gratefully as I stepped back from the door, momentarily satisfied with my lack of findings. As I turned and walked away from the basement door to the fridge, it seemed more and more likely that I'd scared myself in a semi-drunken stupor the night before. The cold leftover pizza from last night served as my comfort for the morning. I stood leaning against the sink and chomped on a slice of pepperoni, thankful for what was finally starting to feel like a normal enough morning. A tinkling sound from behind the basement door broke this temporary peace. I stopped chewing and listened intently again. Silence filled the kitchen, sudden and overbearing. Then it came again, a tiny jangling noise that wasn't exactly unfamiliar. I had heard this noise before, but where? An image began to form in my brain. A thin cord dangling from the center of the ceiling connected to a solitary light bulb above several mounds of junk, as my middle-aged landlord fumbled for the chain. The chain danced across the glassy surface of the light bulb, making a small but unmistakable clinking sound. The sound repeated outside of my head this time, and my eyes flew to the basement door. A new image of something ancient, decaying and dead dragging itself across the piles of forgotten things and groping for the chain with skeletal fingers sprang into my brain. Despite the tremors rocketing through my hands, I moved slowly but steadily back toward the basement door. Again, I pressed my ear to the wood and listened. No light jangling noise came, but the clear sound of a chain being tugged. Looking down, I could see soft yellow light under the crack of the door. I couldn't believe it. It was like a nightmare had followed me out into the day. But there it was regardless. With a great swell of will, I forced myself to stoop down on my knees and lowered my head slowly to the crack under the door. Knock, knock, knock. I fell backwards away from the door and scooted myself down the length of the kitchen, blubbering and stammering half-words and squeaking sounds of fear. Through the crack, the shadow of 2 feet turned and moved back from the door. I heard the chain tug again, and the light beneath the door disappeared. It was a mad dash, getting dressed and out of the house. I needed to be somewhere else. I called up my friend Pat and asked if I could swing by and hang out for a while. He said that'd be fine and asked if I was all right. With a shaky voice, I told him I was fine. Because it's hard to explain over the phone that either you're going insane or your new house has some uninvited presence in the off-limits basement. I'd explain myself when I got there. Probably. On the way, I gave Murray a call. It went straight to voicemail. Murray McDonald Properties. Leave your name, number, and a brief description of your reason for calling, and I will address your needs as I can. The beeping tone invited me to begin my message, and I didn't know what exactly to say. Quickly starting to speak, I gave my name and number along with my address. The last thing I said was definitely brief, but it felt cartoonishly ominous coming out of my mouth, making me worry about how I would seem to anyone I talked to about this. There's something wrong in the basement. Please call back ASAP. I left it at that and hung up. If he was allowed to be cryptic and unhelpful, then I was allowed to be nervous and vague. When I reached Pat's place, he had 5 guys for us both, and I ate it gratefully, realizing how hungry I was. We munched and watched TV for a while, and my mind started to unclench from the night and morning I had gone through on my own. But the day went on, and the morning turned to afternoon. Soon it would be night, and I would be out of reasons to stay at my friend's place. Then, somewhere amidst Netflix and video games, Pat asked the question, "So what was up this morning? You sounded pretty freaked out." For a moment, I debated telling Pat anything because I already knew how crazy this all seemed. And this year hasn't been a stellar one for my mental well-being already. I've worried some folks, but this wasn't that. I told Pat what had happened last night, and this morning, he didn't laugh. He didn't give me that heavy look of concern I'd received so often from so many others. He listened, and when I was done, he looked me in the eye with a strong, steady gaze. "Well, I think we should go back there together." "What?" "Look, man, either this is legitimately the freakiest thing to ever happen to anyone I know, or it's part of some of the shit you're working through. Either way, I don't want you to mess with it all by yourself." I faltered a little and returned his stare dumbly. He just smiled and spoke again. "I'll grab my stuff." Pat stood, clapped me on the back, and went to his room, returning with a backpack slung over his shoulder. He looked at me with eyebrows raised like he was daring me to tell him no. Pat had always been a fierce friend of mine. I can't tell you how glad I was for him in that moment. We both climbed into my car, and I drove us back to my house. We pulled up to the house as the sun was ducking beneath the horizon, laying dusk over the world like a blanket. My stomach was tight as we climbed out of the car. We reached the front door, and my phone went off, making us both jump. I looked at the screen. It was Murray. "It's the landlord," I told Pat, unlocking the door to let him in. "Let's see what he has to say." Pat laughed and went in the door. I accepted the call and put the receiver to my ear. "Do not go back in the house." The words boomed staticky and harsh from the phone, and the front door slammed shut in front of me. I dropped the phone and hammered my fists on the door, calling out to my friend. The doorknob didn't budge in my grip. Desperate, I tried my key once again, and they were flung out of the lock, whizzing past me into the yard. I watched them sail away from me, eyes wide. I slammed once more into the door, and it gave, sending me sprawling into the hallway of the house. The door swung violently on its hinges and struck the wall, bouncing back for a lazy half-swing. The house was almost completely dark, but I spied light on the wall of the living room opposite the kitchen. A shadow moved there, the shadow of a man. It slowly turned and moved out of the light. I called out then, "Pat, where are you, Pat? We gotta go." I scurried forward on my hands and knees, rounding the corner into the living room. I stopped when I could see into the kitchen. The overhead lights were off. The only light was coming from the doorway to the basement. The door was open, and Pat was gone. The tinkling, tugging noise sounded once more, and the basement light went out. With a single source of light extinguished, shadows took the house. I stayed there on my knees, petrified. A strong wind blew against the side of the house, sending whispers through leaves and making the open front door sway listlessly. Goosebumps jolted across my skin like an electric charge, and my jaw clenched shut. A savage wailing sound came streaking up and out of the basement door, clawing its way down the length of the kitchen and embedding itself in my brain. This was a voice I knew, a friendly, loving voice on the end of a phone on my darkest of nights. It was a voice in pain. It was Pat's voice. I had never heard a noise like this come from a person. There were no words at first, just shapeless howls of agony. Every now and then, the wailing grew more intense or heightened in pitch. During these moments, a sound like thick, tightening ropes would crackle up from the dark bowels of the basement. The shrieking reverberated inside my skull, and I wanted to scream along with it. I wanted to shred my lungs with screaming and run until my heart burst in my chest like a merciful bomb. Then 2 words came stretched and trembling across the incoherent exhalations of pain. He opened me. The breath in my throat stuck there, and Pat's face swam to the front of my mind. Every one-sided phone call, late-night marathon of mindless shit, and bona fide cry for help that was answered without a moment's hesitation piled up inside of me, threatening to explode. My feet found the ground, and I was marching into the darkness of the kitchen like a soldier who had been called to battle. I had reached the sink, one palm skimming across the counter to guide me as I walked, when a strong hand gripped my shoulder and began to drag me backwards. I did scream then, a hoarse and breathless screech. I stumbled and slid across the kitchen tile on my ass. The hand did not relinquish its grip, and whoever had me continued to drag me away from Pat's howling voice without breaking stride. We passed the couch and coffee table, turned into the hall, and I was half tossed onto the stoop in front of the house. The door sounded like a coffin lid when it closed behind us. With a frantic drive, I pushed myself to my feet and turned to face my subduer. Murray pressed his back against the door, sweaty and breathless. His eyes burned in the last dying rays of sunlight on the horizon. "What were you doing in there?" he bellowed. I told you not to go back in." My mouth dropped open as it filled with every baffled question and cry of outrage that my brain could produce in that moment. At first, all that would come out were useless strings of half-thoughts and accusations. Finally, I settled on the most condensed form of question my brain could concoct. "What is going on?" My throat ached and my mouth felt like it was lined with drier lint. Murray seemed to calm somewhat, eyeing me closely and putting his hands up defensively, as if to protest his right to be upset. "Well, that's hard to explain. There's a lot you don't understand." His eyes blazed with aggravation again, and he spat through gritted teeth. "I told you not to go down there, not to mess with it at all. I didn't break your rules. I've barely gone near the thing." I took a step closer to the winded old man. "You better try to make me understand. Right. Now." Murray moved away from the door and returned my gaze steadily. The wind kicked up and rustled through the trees again. The boards of the house groaned. He looked away onto the lawn and took a deep breath before he began to answer. I've never seen it happen so fast, seen it decided. Like someone so quick. He grumbled out each word like they were bitter on his tongue. I try to keep an eye out for reactions like this, but I've been at this a good long while. I'm only human and I've got my limits, I'm afraid. Murray shuffled his feet and removed his baseball cap solemnly, mindlessly. I fought the urge to charge back into the house. The wailing from the basement wasn't audible from our place on the porch. My words came quick and sharp. "You're afraid what? What are you talking about?" He turned to face me again, the icy stare reappearing on his ancient-looking face. "I'm afraid that it's learning. From me. From you. From every soul it comes across. I think it's gotten too talented and too efficient at pulling people apart, unraveling them. It's a hungry thing, whatever it is. It takes what it wants when it feels like it's strong enough, or if it thinks something's weak enough. What all have you seen in the house?" I debated whether or not to be honest with him. He hadn't done so much for me, but he had information I needed. Knocking on the door in the kitchen, I've seen the light turn on down there, and I've seen a shadow feet beneath the door. I close my eyes and I can see at the door, waiting for me. Murray looked down and shivered. I thought then it was pity. He turned away from me again and spoke softly with his gravelly voice. "It likes to play with people," he sighed. "I don't know what it is. Not exactly. I don't know who would know that. But I know it's predatory. Most people, the lease comes and goes, and they're none the wiser. I don't know if it sleeps or it picks who it was. But it's impossible for me to tell. I just set my rules and hope people get to end their time here thinking I'm just an eccentric old asshole with a senile streak. But every now and then it sets its sights on someone. I don't know what it is, but it's like it smells blood in the water. I got small complaints at first. Strange noises, light malfunctions, things going missing. I checked for pests, leaks, ventilation problems, you name it. Nothing. It wasn't until the first tenant disappeared that I locked the basement up to anyone but myself. My eyes went wide, and my voice came in a whisper on the evening air. Disappeared, I hissed, hardly letting my mouth move to form the word. Murray flashed his eyes back at me over his shoulder. I came looking for rent the first time it happened. Gave my warning knocks and let myself in. Place was dark, darker than I was ready for, and it stank like chemical fire, real acrid. But the basement door was open. I went down the steps, and it felt like years before I reached the bottom. There was nothing but the light in the middle and shadows playing off the walls. And the shadows, they had him. I don't know how to describe it exactly, but they'd taken this young guy off into the dark. It stretched out everywhere, and I was so scared I'd get lost in it. The wind kicked up again. Murray lowered his head, and his voice came in a husky rasp. I ran. There wasn't anything left the next day. Just a basement down there, dust and cobwebs. The guy's stuff was still there though, so I did the only thing I could think to do. There's no way I don't go to prison for this. I mentioned the basement, and you were immediately suspicious of me. It was just easier to store all the things that were left behind than to explain. He looked up at me, monitoring my reaction. Outrage burned in my cheeks, and my jaw hung open. So what? You've just been offering people up to this thing. You've got to get your rent, I guess, huh? What the hell is wrong with you? Murray turned to face me, and his eyes flashed like dying coals. His gruff voice wavered as he spoke. I tried to keep the house empty. You don't think that was the first thing I did? No way did I want to send another soul in there like home delivery for those things. I took the place off the market, deleted all the listings, and boarded the bastard up doors, windows, the chimney. I would have burned it down if it didn't look like an insurance scam. Let it rot, right? He took a step closer to me, breathing his words into my face. But it's hungry, you see. It's predatory. About a month after I closed her off, I was in Chicago visiting my sister and her kid. They put me up in a hotel in the city. Full suite and everything. I hadn't thought about this house for months. But when I went to turn in for the night, it was there. That light beneath the door. The line of stale yellow light peeking into the darkened world of the house appeared in my mind, and I looked down. Murray nodded grimly. It was there beneath the hotel room door. It was the basement light. It went on and off for an hour before the knocking started. I thought I'd finally blown a circuit in my brain, but it made me just crazy enough to open the door. I looked at him again. The icy clear focus I saw there made me shake. He spoke again. The basement was there. It had followed me to Chicago. The light went out, and something started coming up the steps toward me. I slammed the door and didn't sleep that night. The message was clear then. As long as there was someone between me and it, I'd be okay. But I had to rent the house out. You have to believe me. I had to. I wanted to hate him, to call him a coward. But thinking of the silhouette standing and waiting on the other side of the door, and the taunting, playful sound of the light bulb's chain being tugged made wonder what I wouldn't do to be free from this nightmare. Then Pat's agonized voice came to my mind again, and my hands flew to my face at the thought of what was being done to him. Those sounds, those stretching, tightening sounds. A scream came lunging out of the recesses of the house, and both Murray and I spun to face the front door. I launched myself toward the entrance, but Murray sprang forward and grabbed me. He spoke through gritted teeth as I struggled to get free of his grasp. What was that noise? He's still in there. Murray swung me around and pressed me against the wall of the house. Jesus Christ, you brought someone else. A great shriek came from deep within the house, making Murray's jaw drop and loosening his grip on me. I pulled away from him and scrambled for the door, but his hands found me again. My words came in increasingly frantic breaths and sobs. Pat's in there. He's my friend, man. He's my friend, and he just wanted to help, and it's hurting him. Whatever it is, it's hurting my friend, man. It took him. It took him, and it wanted me. I have to get him back. Get off me." Tears had begun to track down my cheeks. The older man held fast to the collar of my shirt, and pity flared up in his eyes. I'm sorry, but I don't think there is any getting him back." Anger bloomed in my brain, then a deliberate and unshaking spite for the situation. My friend who was always there when I needed him needed me. He came to help me, and it would take whatever demise the shadows that waited in the basement had planned for me to keep me from coming to help him. I shoved Murray away with unfamiliar strength and drew in deep, feverish breaths through my nose. "You can't make me leave him." He wouldn't leave me. Murray looked at me sadly for a long second before taking another step back. "I'm sorry. I can't go back in there. I won't." He ran off the porch towards his waiting truck. Again, I wanted to judge him, but he only did what I wanted to do, what anyone would want to do. Bucking against that what-if lizard part of my brain that pulled at the reins of my mind, I turned slowly and entered the house again, the door shutting with a final sounding thud behind me. The shadows had grown thick in the few minutes I had been outside with Murray. The growing twilight outside had blanketed the house in darkness that was growing every minute. In the living room, the clock ticked out the seconds, echoing into the emptiness. Pat's screams seemed to rocket hoarsely up out of the basement in great strokes of pain. That sound was the only thing that spurred my footsteps forward. My eyes were adjusting to the shadows as I entered the tiled passageway to the basement door. I grabbed a kitchen knife from the drawer beside the sink as I passed. This helped keep my steps at a steady pace until I reached the utter blackness of the open basement door. Where the closed door looked like a waiting grin, it looked like a snarling maw when opened. It looked like an entrenched predator's mouth waiting, daring some foolish animal to venture into the shadows, just for a moment. That's all it took. I stood at the edge of what felt like an abyss, trying to make myself jump. Pat screamed again, his voice tightening and screeching upward until it became an animal squeal, and I stepped into the darkness. The steps moaned under my feet, and heat pressed thickly to my skin as I descended. When Murray had brought me down here in the day, there had been maybe 10 steps. That night I climbed down at least 100, all the while Pat screamed wordlessly for help. I don't know how many steps I'd descended when they ended, and I fell outright into the pitch-black void below. The ground found me quickly. I landed on my side and cried out, the air bursting out of me. When I looked up, I saw a fire in the center of the basement, or what should have been the basement. This room was much, much larger than the one Murray had shown me the day of our tour. I tried but couldn't see the outer walls on any side of the room. The floor was smooth, flat concrete all around. It reflected the firelight dimly near the center of the chamber. The warm, weak light of the fire made a bright circle about 20 feet wide around itself. I edged into the light and scanned the seemingly massive chamber. Just in front of the fire itself, a shape caught my eye, Pat. I ran forward to help my friend, but slowed as I approached him. He was spread eagle on the ground, his eyes were shut tight, and he bared his teeth, gritting and spitting as high-pitched screams sprang from between his lips. My brain struggled to understand what was happening to him. At first, I thought he was being buried alive. It reminded me of days at the beach as a kid, burying limbs and whole bodies in the sand to burst forth. The transition from limb to ground was so neat and smooth that my eyes hardly believed it. His legs stopped in a smooth, straight plane just below his knees, and the concrete began. But there was something I wasn't seeing, my brain floundering to process the visual input being presented. The noise like straining rope got louder, and Pat let out another shriek. That's when I saw what was happening. The denim of Pat's jeans pulled taut, stretched, and then faded into the concrete. I heard loud crunching noises as my friend's knees collapsed like oversized pecans, sending a squeal out between his gritted teeth. Where his legs met the concrete, it seemed that his lower half was being stamped into the floor's surface. 2 legs, tennis shoes, and jean cuffs included appeared black and inky on the concrete. Pat's fingers dug at the floor behind him, trying to pull himself away from whatever force was slowly flattening and devouring his body. On the ground, the silhouette of Pat's legs began to shimmer and flicker in the firelight. It looked like the shadowy image was steaming, sending up a strong bitter smell and stinging my eyes. I looked beside Pat's newly stamped shadow. A stone rose in my throat, and an audible gasp hissed between my lips. Another shadow crawled beside Pat, the shadow of a man that moved in jitters and shudders. This shape moved without anything to cast it, and it was growing. It slithered up beside Pat and snaked what looked like claws up to the shadow being made of his lower body. Elongated fingers raked across the concrete where Pat's legs once were. Pat's body jerked and slid down away from the weak fire. His thighs looked like twin tubes of denim toothpaste as they began to feed through whatever force had a hold of him. Another high squeal of anguish spat out of Pat's lips, and I ran forward. Skirting the moving shadow, I came around Pat's left side and took his arm in both my hands. He looked up at me, straining to grip my hand as tightly as he could. His eyes were hopeful in that moment. I would get him out of this. We would make it. A violent, wrenching tug came from Pat's midsection, and it looked like his chest cavity went from 3 dimensions to 2 in the space of a second. The skin of Pat's face turned an impossible blue and purple color, and blood jetted out of every orifice it could find. He made a noise like a vacuum cleaner stuck on a curtain. I think he was trying to breathe. All I can be sure of is I felt bones in my hand start to crack in Pat's death grip. I think he said one last thing to me. It's hard to be sure, but I think he did. I want to believe he did. Whatever helps us sleep, I guess. Run. It rasped its way out of his lips, and his eyes rolled back up into his skull. He was gone, and my feet found themselves again. I turned to flee, but was wrenched backwards by the iron grip still anchoring me to Patrick's vanishing form. His hand clutched mine in an inescapable iron trap. I grabbed my trapped left hand with my free right and tugged desperately. The moving shadow gave another jerking motion. A whip went through Pat's body, and the rest of him sank into the concrete. A shaded imprint of Pat's form lay neatly stamped onto the floor. It shimmered and billowed like a cloud. There were no features on the now flat face. The pain and the blood were replaced by solid black. A mournful cry escaped my lips, and I struck the ground with my free hand. It occurred to me then that my left hand was still not free. Eyes wide, I slowly turned to look at it. My hand was sunken into the concrete. There on the hard surface appeared the 2-dimensional rendering of one hand gripping another. I stared at my wrist, now seemingly pressed flat against the shadow of my former hand. After a split second, the pain blossomed from underneath adrenaline, a great crushing weight that presses in from everywhere focused on my wrist. I stared in disbelief as the moving shadows slinked up around Pat's imprinted remains. The 2 black shapes swirled together, pooling around my wrist while I gaped. They shuddered, convulsed, and began to form something hulking and monstrous. And then the lurching, ripping, sucking feeling like I was a stray spaghetti noodle in the gigantic mouth of the world. A strong, burning sensation seared its way across the nerves of my left hand, and that sound like thick ropes being stretched whipped across my eardrums. My wrist began to sink deeper into the ground, bones crunching beneath that immeasurable force. I found my voice then, or it found me. A scream came rocketing out of my gut, wild and ragged in my throat. I wrenched my arm, working my shoulder and elbow violently. Images of animals caught in a hunter's trap swam through my mind, and the desperation that flooded my brain couldn't be described as anything but animal. It was a simple, growing certainty that I was going to be consumed. I was going to be eaten. There was no saving my friend. There was no escape. There was just the darkness rolling in to take away everything. I was like the tide melts away shapes etched in the sand. Then one of my kicking legs caught one of the lit logs from the fire, sending it skating into the shadowy mass growing on the ground. The shadows shifted on the ground and fractured as the one source of light split into 2. My wrist rose from the ground in a violent jerking tug. Bile rose in my throat looking at the twisted nub that hung there. There was no hand at the end of my left wrist, but what looked like the gnarled, flesh-colored version of the twist on the end of an old-fashioned candy wrapper. A snarling screech drew my eyes back to the concrete. The shadowy mass was swirling and writhing in front of me, tendrils striking out here and there. It wanted its second helping. I stumbled to my feet again and lurched for the stairs. My left arm hugged itself to my body as I lumbered forward. Behind me, the sound of the crackling fire was joined by a great thundering howl. The ground shook beneath my feet. When I reached the stairs, I clambered up the first 3 and fell breathless, working to regain my footing. My eyes darted to the center of the large chamber once more. Spreading out from the dim light created by the fire, I saw an army of shades crouched and bent like feral animals stalking something smaller, something weaker. They all flickered and faltered in the firelight, but they were coming closer. I began to pull myself up the stairs, scrambling with all 3 still workable limbs and remembering the extended staircase I had come down. As I climbed, screams and shrieks came echoing to my ears. Cries for help, screams of agony, and lonely pleas for someone to turn on the light. Below all the rest, a sound like 2 stones dragging over each other slowly and steadily reverberated through the walls. It grew louder and louder, and I thought I would lose my mind. The steps wouldn't stop, and the voices in the dark drenched me with despair. I closed my eyes and just kept climbing, while those sad, hungry sounds bored into my skull. When I reached the basement door, I spilled out into the kitchen and collapsed into a heap on the tile floor. I heard the door shut loudly behind me and flipped on my back, arms and legs raised to shield me from whatever had followed me out of the basement. Murray stepped forward and reached out a hand. "Come on, kid. We've got to go." I gripped his outstretched hand limply, and he hauled me to my feet. The momentum sent me swaying forward on my feet, and my vision swam. I collapsed into the larger man's arms, and the world went dark. I woke up in a hospital bed, bandages and gauze over my left wrist. They told me I had been asleep for the better part of a day. The man who had brought me in was gone. They asked me a lot of questions, the doctors, the police, my friends. I didn't have answers for them. I could hardly bring myself to speak at all. What explanation could I give them? How could I even explain any of this to myself honestly without feeling like the lines of my reality were starting to go fuzzy? My parents insisted that I come stay with them for a while. I accepted. Murray's phone was disconnected, and he disappeared off the web. I quit my job. My chest felt too heavy to sit up in the mornings. The days started to blur together. Sleep was my refuge for a while. I was on a sedative, and the dreamless periods of unconsciousness were like oxygen. A couple months after I started taking them, though, the dreams came back. Or I think they're dreams. I'm praying they're dreams. I go out in the hall, and there's a new door down at the end. My parents' house has plain plywood doors, washed dark brown. This door stands bright white in what used to be a solid wall bearing family memories and school photos. I know because those framed pictures are strewn in front of the place where they once hung. Beneath the door, there's a soft yellow light radiating out into the darkness of the hallway. It glints off the glass of the pictures and twinkles in my eyes. I see the shadow of 2 feet appear one after the other on the other side of the door. The light footsteps can hardly be heard. I freeze solid, unable to move, unable to breathe. It knocks. Knock. 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 I want to scream or run or die. I just want it to end. Let me go or let me die. Please. And then the voice comes from behind the pale wood. I think we should go back there together. Knock. 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 I always wake up drenched in sweat. The lights aren't ever turned out in my room. I can't stand the thought of the room covered in shadows. But I eye every dark corner with suspicion, and my heart pounds in my chest. I don't get many restful nights. It happened every night this past week. I wet the 2 nights ago, getting up in the wee hours to set them to wash. Last night I didn't sleep. But the door was there anyways. I heard the knocking from my bedroom. It was loud and demanding, echoing out into the house with every strike. I crept out into the hall from my bedroom, eyes on the ground. The knocks crashed out into the darkness, and I looked up. Hello again. I know it this time. You've been dreaming about me. I didn't stop dreaming about you. My lower lip trembled, and I thought I might weep. I lurched forward towards the door, and the pale yellow light appeared beneath. The tinkling of chain on light bulb echoed up from the non-existent basement beneath my parents' house, and I heard the groan of old wooden steps beneath heavy feet. The shadow appeared beneath the door when I approached its surface. That low sound I remember from the basement ground out from below, a sound like God grinding his teeth together. It crashed in around me, and I clutched my skull. The walls shook, and it felt like the house might collapse in on us at any moment. But the sounds disappeared, and the walls stood firm. The shaking stopped. A soft knocking came from behind the door. Knock, knock, knock. "Help me, man. You have to help me." His voice was strangely calm, but his words were desperate. Then the doorknob began to jitter back and forth, softly at first, then violently. I stumbled back a step. "You left me. You have to come back. You can't leave me." The doorknob shuddered and vibrated, and the soft knocking was replaced with deafening slams of force. Boom, boom, boom. I fled back to my bedroom, shutting the door and retreating beneath my covers. The thundering knocks resounded through the house, followed by a howl. Then I felt something on my hand, my left hand. At first I couldn't pinpoint the feeling nor grasp the regained sensation. My mouth hung open as I stared at the twisted place at the end of my wrist. The pain started, and I realized what the feeling was. Teeth. 100 little mouths were digging into the flesh of my stolen hand. I could feel each one tear into skin and chew on bone. I screamed out into the darkness, tears streaming down my face. I whimpered and swore and begged. Then everything was quiet, and the pain was fading, numbing in the quiet. The voice came again. "I want to help. Let me help." I woke up this morning, breathless and sweating. My left wrist aches. I'm afraid. I can't reach Murray. His number has been disconnected. My parents won't be here this weekend. It's just me, and I'm afraid. I'm afraid of what's coming tonight. I'm afraid of seeing that door again. I'm afraid of hearing Pat's hurt, demanding voice. I'm afraid that, if the door is there again tonight and Pat comes knocking, I'll answer it. I'm afraid. Day 1. Just moved into my new home yesterday, and boy am I tired. Kinda want to watch TV all day and sleep. Kinda want to be social with the people in the neighborhood. I'm usually not in a social mood, but hey, this is my first home where I'm living by myself, and I'm excited. Besides, I need people to watch football games with on Sundays, and drinking beer by yourself in a dark room watching sports sounds like a nightmare. Hey, too tired. Maybe tomorrow. Day 2. Decided to be a productive citizen today and meet the neighbors. Was hoping I'd find a cute girl my age, but no such luck. I started off with my next-door neighbors, 'cause why not? The first house was a lovely old couple named Mr. and Mrs. Prescott. Mr. Prescott was a Vietnam veteran and told me that he just now recently became a new grandfather. Seemed like a cool guy to hear some stories from in the future if I ever got bored. Not to mention Mrs. Prescott's cooking was bomb. The other house wasn't quite as pleasant. It was inhabited by some fat slob whose first words when he saw me were, "Who are you?" with a frowned expression as he looked me up and down. His gruff, deep voice made me feel thin and inferior, as if I was wasting his time. When I answered that I was his new neighbor, he just howled with laughter and slammed the door shut in my face. What a prick. I headed a few houses over and met a nice young couple by the name of Robinson. They had a baby girl named Chloe that wasn't much older than 12 months. The father, Peter, was definitely that new friend I was looking for. We drank the same beers, watched the same sports teams, and shared the same taste in music. His wife, Sarah, was nice to look at, but I know better than to go further than that. I really liked these people. Day 3. I decided to spend the night at home after work instead of being social again. I didn't want people to think I was some social freak. My night wasn't too boring, though. Around 10 p.m. the lights in my house went out for like a minute, then came back on. What was weird about it was that there weren't any storms. Must have been an electrical surge or something. Day 4. Still not feeling the social vibe yet, but I might ask Peter and Sarah to do something tomorrow. Dinner would be cool. I thought I was done with my journal entry for the day, but I was just woken up some loud thud in my house. I checked around the place and found no sign of an intruder. However, when I went to bed, I looked out of my window to see Mr. Prescott. He was in his pajamas staring out of his window into my room. I went to wave at him, but he didn't wave back. He just stood there. After I went downstairs to get a snack, he was still staring out the window, but now he was staring at me, smiling and waving. Repeatedly, just smiling and waving. Nothing moving but his worn-out arm. Even his smile was cold solid still. I couldn't go to sleep that night, and it didn't help that Mr. Prescott did this until the sun rose. Freaky, but I just figured that it was an old person thing. I really need to get some curtains for this window. Day 5. Today I asked Peter and his wife to come over for dinner, but they said they were too busy. Not 2 hours after I asked, Sarah arrived at my front door. I asked her that I thought she was busy, and she told me she wasn't, but Peter was. That's when things started to get out of hand. When I offered her something to eat, she just reached for my pants and said, "You can eat me," with a smirk on her face. "I loved the way you were looking at me the other day," she said. I pushed her away and told her to go home. She had to be drunk off her mind. She just laughed and ran home, like sprinted home as if she was being chased, except she was laughing hysterically. Later that night, I saw old Mr. Prescott staring out his window again, looking in my room, except this time he was pointing at me with his stale finger and his mouth wide open. He was shaking furiously as if he was choking, but his arm was perfectly still. When I moved away from his point, he continued to aim his finger where I used to be. Day 6. Peter and Sarah came over for dinner tonight. I wasn't going to tell Peter what happened with Sarah and I because I knew he would take her word over mine, considering he had only met me once. Other than the awkward tension between Sarah and I that apparently only I was feeling, they were great guests until we ate. Instead of eating the food I made them, they just pulled out their own food that they had brought from home. I thought it was incredibly rude, but who knows, maybe they were Jewish and couldn't eat the sausage linguine that I made. Old Mr. Prescott was at it again with a finger pointing. I think I might address the matter to him tomorrow. I'm starting to feel like my room is haunted. Day 7. I'm currently typing this on my phone as I'm driving 80 on the highway. Sure, it's dangerous, but I already feel like a dead man. I decided to confront Mr. Prescott about his evening behaviors. When I went to visit him that night, neither Mr. or Mrs. Prescott opened the door when I knocked, even though their lights were on. I figured that they had bad hearing, so I went ahead and opened the front door. I guess they always leave it unlocked. I called their names in the house, but no one answered. I decided to go to their room, and there he was, pointing. Standing there, shaking his whole body and pointing right at my glass window. I slowly started to walk up towards his frail body that looked like it would collapse at any second. I wanted to know what the F he was pointing at. "Mr. Prescott," I said. No response. "Mr. Prescott, why are you pointing in my room?" He opened his mouth wider and proceeded to laugh. No mouth movement. Just yelling and laughter as his frightened face continued to point in my room. I wanted to know what was so funny, and then I saw it. I never noticed it before because of my angle of perception in the room. Mr. Prescott's room was a little bit higher, so I could see it in the mirror by my bed. Underneath the bed was a man with what looked like a pig mask and black clothes. His eyes were already making contact with mine using the mirror. He knew I could see him. I thought I saw the pig face smile. How long had he been there? I ran out of the house and tried to get help. The first thing I thought to do was go to Peter's. I ran inside without any warning, hoping I would have consent after I explained my situation. Except no one was home. No one except Chloe snoozing with her teddy bear in her crib. I called Peter and Sarah's name, and there was no response. All I could think of was to get a phone since I left my cell in the house. I searched the living room and found nothing. Now I know I had gone too far at this point with breaking and entering into people's home, but frankly, I didn't give a shit at this point. I checked Peter and Sarah's room with no luck, so I decided to check the basement. I started to descend the stairs until a strong scent of death passed through my nose and into my soul. I opened the door only to find what I would describe as a hellhole. Arms, legs, heads with eyes gouged, all hanging on the ceiling like they were stakes. Worst of all, I looked across the room to see a wall of pictures. Pictures of my house. Pictures of my room. Pictures of me sleeping. pictures of me staring at Mr. Prescott through the window. As I began to run up the stairs, I looked up to see the pig-masked man staring at me from the doorway. He had a butcher's knife in hand and waved it around as if he was dancing with it. "Peter, you don't have to do this. Just let me leave and I won't say a word to anyone about what you've been doing, I promise. Just let me leave." I trembled as he seemed to dance towards me. "I'm hungry," he playfully chanted. "Are you not hungry? Sarah said you weren't hungry for her. I wanted you to taste her. She was my gift, and you denied it." He dashed at me down the stairs, and I went for the garage door. I wasn't able to open it in time before Peter came at me with his knife. He was giggling the whole time like he was a young boy chasing little girls on a playground. I found a wooden plank and knocked him on the side of his head. It gave me just enough time to throw the garage door up to escape. I looked back as I sprinted to my car only to see Sarah slowly walk to Peter's aid. They began to kiss, both wearing pig masks. I started my ignition and backed out of my driveway. Mr. and Mrs. Prescott were standing on the sidewalk waving. That same wave. I decided to stay at a nearby motel. I got a call around 3 a.m. from the motel's phone. There was no answer from the other end when I picked up. When I began to end the call, I heard a voice. "It's a good thing we caught up with ya. I thought we were going to watch Sunday football tomorrow. Sarah made some tasty brownies for us. Anyway, don't be a stranger and stop by room 105 to say hi." I'm staying in room 104. Part 2. Day 8. Don't worry guys, I'm safe. I spent the night at the motel, but I made sure to lock the door tight and put a chair behind the knob in case Peter and Sarah tried to break in. I didn't go to sleep. The walls in the motel were thin and all I could hear was Sarah's singing. Some of you were wondering about how I had a cell phone to type all of this out. Luckily, I left my cell in my car before I went to the Prescott's house. I went straight to their house after I parked, so I guess I got lucky. Or maybe it was fate. I don't know. I've never really thought about those things. I made a decision in the night. I had to go back. All I could think about was tiny sweet Chloe having to be raised by those monsters, and for once I had to think about someone other than myself. I just hoped they left Chloe at their house. First things first, I had to escape the motel without Peter and Sarah being able to catch me. I was sure they had been waiting for the sound of a car ignition outside of their door all night, so I did something I probably should have done a while ago. 911, what is your emergency? Yes, I'm staying at the Ryan Motel off Temple Street. A young couple is staying in the room next to me at room 105, and I think they are going to kill me. Why would they want to kill you? I found a human butcher's shop in their basement last night. They are my neighbors, and they want to kill me so I don't reveal their secret. Okay, we have dispatched police to your location. In just 5 minutes, I looked out of my window to see one police car arrived. Just one. What the F were they thinking? These are serial killers, and they send one cop car. To make things worse, only one cop stepped out of the vehicle. I watched as she stepped out of her vehicle and walked towards room 105. She knocked on the door. "Coming," I heard Sarah's voice yell through the walls. I listened intently to their conversation as she opened the door. "Sarah," I heard the cop say. "Tammy, how are you doing?" That's right. She knew the psychopaths. "Sarah, it's so great to see you. I received a phone call saying that there were some kind of crazy serial killers in this room. Weird, right? It's probably just some guy being stupid. I don't know why people waste a cop's time making up stories just to be silly. Here, why don't you come in?" "Sure, why not? I've had a long day." I heard the door close. I felt messed up at first, but I realized it gave me an opening to get away while they were distracted with the cop. It would be obvious they are guilty if they left the cop just to chase me. I turned the keys and wheeled out of the parking lot. I didn't have much time, so I had to get there fast. Upon arriving, I parked at Peter and Sarah's house and tried to run inside only to find the door locked. I could have tried the windows, but with blood rushing through my veins and highway to the danger zone blasting in my head, I decided to be a badass and just kicked the door down. I sprinted for the crib only to find nothing but the teddy bear Chloe was holding last night. I couldn't give up. I checked the rest of the house except for the basement because F that, and found nothing. The only thing I could think to do was search the other houses. Maybe they gave Chloe to the neighbors to babysit her while they were out trying to bring this messed up neighborhood some human BBQ home. I started with Mr. and Mrs. Prescott's house. When I arrived, the door was wide open. This gave me a sense of urgency. Mr. and Mrs. Prescott weren't exactly the most stable of people. I creeped into the house and slowly closed the door. I heard muttering coming from upstairs near Mr. Prescott's room. I grabbed the baseball bat that was used for display near the living room and went up the moaning wooden stairs with caution. As I got higher, the muttering got louder. I killed him. I kid HM. I killed him. 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 Mr. Prescott was laying in fetal position in front of his room with the door shut. I killed him. 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 I stepped over the sick, wrinkly man and slowly creaked open the door. Inside, above his bed, was Mrs. Prescott, nailed to the walls. Her guts were sprawled across the bed, intestines hanging from her stomach. Above her head was a message scrawled in blood. And then this little piggy went wee 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 all the way home. All over the walls, ceiling, and floor were the words home repeated in different sizes and shapes. He killed my brothers. Stand up, soldier. Don't cry. Death is a part of life, you piece of shit. Kill those commies. Kill them. Kill. Mr. Prescott shouted during his post-traumatic breakdown outside of the door. Scattered across the floor were a group of photos. Ever since last night, I don't know if I like looking at pictures anymore, but maybe it could have helped me find Chloe. They were family photos. Mr. and Mrs. Prescott with 3 children. In all of the photos, one of the kids' faces were crossed out with a red X, the same kid every time. I took a harder look at the children in the photo and my heart sank. It was them. It was Peter and Sarah, brother and sister, holding hands and smiling that same smile Mr. and Mrs. Prescott had. I don't know how I didn't put 2 and 2 together. Mr. Prescott told me when we met he just became a grandfather, and Chloe being basically a newborn. It all made sense. I kept staring at the picture of the 3rd kid with his face crossed out. Who was he? I naturally fell into babysitting around the age of 14. Through friends and family, I got leads for babysitting to score some cash, which definitely beat having to work at a restaurant. The job had its ups and downs, but overall it wasn't a bad gig at all. Yet, as many good experiences as I had, they were all eclipsed by one night. A new family in town talked to my dad at work, and it turned out that they needed a babysitter. I happily took the job and found myself watching their 10-year-old boy a couple of weeks later. There was nothing out of the ordinary about the family themselves. They were the model citizens of suburban America, complete with the white picket fence and blue shutters. Nothing about their house was strange or even unique. Their son Avery was very mild-mannered and polite. Even their car was basic. Not that these were bad things, but I expected it to be a very boring night. What I did not expect was the uncomfortable, inexplicable feeling that I got when I set foot in the house. A chill ran through me, but there was no draft. I rubbed my arms as I gazed at their staircase as we passed. They gave me a brief tour of the house before they left a note of instructions and all the usual information I expected from a job. While trying to figure out what was making me so uneasy about the place, I noticed something about their basement door when I passed it. A padlock was placed on the door, along with a deadbolt in place. Any questions? The father asked as my mind was pulled out of my curiosity. No, sir. Everything looks great. So they left in Avery, and I played some games before I made dinner. A couple of times I thought I heard Avery call me into the den. Both times I found him sitting on the couch in what most recognize as the TV zombie state. He denied having called me, and I went back to making dinner. After the 3rd time, I told Avery it wasn't funny, and that he should stop. I'm not doing anything, I'm just watching TV. His voice went to that higher tone of pleading, sounding desperate for me to believe him. Avery, I know it's my first time and sometimes you want to test things out, but I'm trying to get dinner ready, so if you call me again, I'm not checking on you, okay? I didn't say anything. The child glared at the TV with a pouting face, and I began to feel bad. As many times as I've heard lies, I was starting to sense that he was telling the truth. So what was I hearing? Hey, it's fine. I'm not mad. Promise. Avery turned his head back towards me, seeming to test if I was the one fibbing now. How about I let you stay up a little later if we forget about it? Do you really promise? Pinky promise. With our contractual pinkies interlocked, spirits were raised again, and I was able to finish dinner. Although I didn't finish without hearing Avery's voice calling me once more. I ignored it, and when Avery didn't mention it at dinner, I figured it was him fooling around again. The whole time we chatted as we ate, I couldn't help but feel that something was not right about this house. As hard as I tried to not look, my eyes kept diverting to the heavy padlock and chain on the basement door. Curiosity got the best of me, and as we were cleaning up, I couldn't help but ask. So Avery, what's the deal with the basement door? What do you mean? His words did not match his demeanor. It was obvious he didn't make eye contact as he forced his sentence out. Come on, you know what I mean. The padlock, chain, and deadbolt. Y'all have dangerous chemicals down there. Avery's face grew paler, and he stared at the wall for a moment. Hey, it's okay. You don't have to tell me. I didn't mean to. Dad said no one can talk about it anymore. This really threw me off, and I couldn't possibly finish my sentence now. A thick veil of tension materialized between us. So you guys aren't allowed to talk about it. Avery shook his head. Okay, that's cool. No big deal. It was nothing but a big deal. Was their dad doing something illegal down there? Or was it something strange that no one could do anything about it? Maybe their dad was in denial about something going on. There were too many questions going through my head now. Hey, how about we put on a movie? Yeah, sure. What am I saying? Everyone likes movies, right? Now excited, we decided on a fun movie that quickly pulled our minds away from the mysterious basement door. Well, that's not entirely true. Maybe Avery was distracted, but it was killing me. As we ate popcorn, I couldn't help but watch Avery, wondering what was going on in that little head of his. Was there something awful going on in the house, and there was nothing I could do to stop it? Or maybe the dad was just... Stop, I told myself inwardly. Mulling over it all endlessly was not doing myself any favors. So the movie ended, and I ushered the drifting child to his bed. Now, the house was all to myself until 12, so I had a good 3.5 hours to myself. Immediately, I began texting my friend to tell her all about the weird experience I was having that night. She dismissed it, saying that I was getting spooked by a new place. This annoyed me to no end. I'd been at bigger, way creepier looking houses, but never got weird vibes like this. Then, I heard it. Stephanie. I went instantly still and listened intently. You didn't hear that, Steph. Just keep texting your friend and... Stephanie. There was no mistaking it this time. It was definitely coming from the basement. The acoustics couldn't have been from Avery upstairs. The voice sounded like a little girl's. In fact, I'm not even sure he could make his voice like that anyway. Slowly, I stood up from the couch and approached the door. Maybe like earlier, I was just hearing things. Maybe being creeped out by the house was starting to mess with my head. That made sense, right? Stephanie? I jumped back from the door, almost wetting myself in the process. There was no way I could dismiss it as anything else now. There was a little girl's voice coming from the basement. Hello, I responded. I couldn't keep my voice from shaking. Is this Stephanie? Why, yes, it's Stephanie. Can you help me? Who are you? Why are you locked in the basement? My name is Meredith Rosenberg. They're kept me locked up for a long time now. The police were almost on to them, and that's why they moved. Can you get me out?" A cold shock washed over me and made it hard to respond. Was I actually babysitting for a family that kept a little girl prisoner? Oh my God. How long have you been locked up with them? Ever since I can remember. I felt somehow hot and cold at the same time and wanted to throw up. This all made sense now with what Avery had told me. Of course his father didn't want him talking about the door. I just need to find the keys and I can. They're hidden in the garage underneath the metal shelf. It's inside a magnetic key holder. Okay, just hold tight. In a panic to free the poor girl, I darted into the garage and began feeling the space underneath the bottom shelf, and sure enough, there was a magnetic key holder there. Running back, I popped the key holder open and began to insert the key into the padlock. Did you find it? Yes, sweetie, I'm almost there. Oh, please hurry. Sometimes they come home early. This sent me into even more of a rush, and I barely managed to fumble the key into the padlock. I finally heard the successful click of the padlock, pulled the chain off, and slid the deadbolt to the right. I'm coming, Meredith. Hold on. I turned the doorknob and threw open the door, only to be met with darkness. Now full of adrenaline, my hands felt around for the light switch. Finally finding my purchase, I flicked the light on, which lit up most of the stairs. Meredith, I called out. Unless I was remembering it wrong, it sounded like her voice was just on the other side of the door a minute ago. In fact, it was quite strange that she wasn't waiting for me at the top of the stairs. Wouldn't you immediately run out of a basement that you were locked in for God knows how long? I'm down here, the little girl's voice called out. Judging from the distance, it sounded like she was calling from somewhere at the bottom of the stairs. My brain suddenly began piecing all the details of this interaction together, and the idea of going down into the basement became absolutely terrifying. Meredith, you can come up now. The door's open. I couldn't hide the tremor in my voice. Why I was scared of a little girl was beyond me, but much like the house itself, something felt very wrong here. I hurt my leg, Owa. When you said you were getting the key, I went back down to get some of my things and got hurt. Ah. Her sounds of pain filled me with sorrow, but an invisible force was holding me back from taking another step into that basement. Can you move? Maybe pull yourself up on the railing. I can't. It hurts too bad. Okay, sweetie, what's wrong? Won't you help me? It's just really dark down there and I don't want to get hurt too. Is there any way you can get to the stairs? Any way at all? I tried to sit up, but my shoulder hurts too much. I thought you said your leg got hurt. The words hung in the air like a noose. It was only after I said it that I realized there was several things seriously wrong about all of this. A question popped into my head I didn't even have time to think about until now. How did she know where the padlock key was? A deathly silence took up the space between me and wherever this girl was. It was a standoff, and I couldn't think of anything else to say. There were questions I could ask her to figure out what was happening, but I felt that her answers weren't going to be honest. Perhaps at this point, the truth was too frightful to know. Meredith, are you still there? It was a stupid question, but it was the only thing my mind could conjure. The additional silence only unnerved me, so I decided to try and get a better look. Fishing my phone out of my pocket, I clicked on the flashlight. It didn't do me any good because of the awful range, so I did the one thing I'd already told myself not to do. I took a step forward. Maybe it was the angle of the stairs or the lighting, but that one step gave me more information than I ever wanted to know. I caught a better view of the bottom step, which was essentially a ledge into a black abyss. Something looked different on this step, but it took a second to register what it was. The step was wet, a pool of some unknown liquid overflowing into the darkness of the basement. I knew for sure that the father hadn't mentioned any flooding, so it would be way too random for that. So I stood there, watching in frozen curiosity as the puddle then suddenly rippled, and I realized the abominable truth. It wasn't water. It was a puddle of saliva. and something was drooling into it from the dark. A wretched chuckle emanated from the horrid void beyond the step, and it cemented me even further into place. It was a wet chortle and positively evil. "How did you like my voices?" the thing said from the dark. "I've been practicing." The epiphany creeped down my spine. It was now talking in Avery's voice. Everything in my body screamed at me to run. I heard the screams, but I couldn't respond no matter how hard I tried. A pity, though. Almost got you. At this, the most gruesome face peeled back the shadows and revealed itself, along with its unearthly mandibles and small fountain of saliva. My faculties finally came to, and I threw myself into the house and kicked the door closed. In mere seconds, I had the door bolted and chained. Leaning against the door, my chest heaved as I struggled to catch my breath. Just as I felt I was safe, the door shuddered as a terrible blow rocked it. I screamed and ran upstairs to grab Avery. I practically dragged the poor kid out the door and called the police. It wasn't until the operator came on that I realized I was about to report a monster in the house. Thinking quickly, I told them that I heard a burglar in the home. It wasn't long before the police and Avery's parents came home. Nothing was found, even in the basement, but I didn't even care at that point. I just wanted the hell out of that house and away from whatever that thing was. Avery's parents kept glancing at me funny the whole time, probably because they knew I had their basement key. I shoved it into their hands before I hugged Avery and got into my car to drive home. That poor kid has to live in that house with that thing, but there was nothing I could do about it. As long as I am alive, I will never, ever set foot in that house again. And as for basements go, I can't go into them anymore. I just simply can't. My husband had something really messed up happen with his neighbor when he was little. The neighbors that lived beside him seemed like a normal, happy family husband, wife and son around my husband's age at the time, around 10 years old. Anyways, one day, the cops show up, a lot of them, and it turns out the husband was cheating on his wife and ended up murdering her, and this all went down on his son's birthday. I mean, how messed up and horrible is that? The poor kid will always remember his mom dying on his birthday and his dad getting taken away because he killed her. Every night I watch people go into my neighbor's house. I first noticed when I was in my kitchen at 3 a.m. getting a glass of water. I suffer from insomnia, so I'm often up at that time, wandering around my house aimlessly. I live alone, so the only person this bothers is myself. I heard a car door shut and saw my neighbor across the street going inside his house, followed by 2 girls wearing sequin dresses and strappy heels. This wasn't suspicious in and of itself. From the few neighborhood interactions I'd had with my neighbor, I knew he enjoyed clubbing. I just figured he'd gotten lucky tonight. I finished my glass of water and watched my neighbor's lights turn on. His curtains were drawn, so I chuckled and muttered, "Have a good time, man." I turned away and retreated to my living room, watching TV until the sun came up. It felt as though I had dozed off, though I doubted I was so lucky, when, through my living room front window, I saw my neighbor get into his car alone and pull out of his driveway. I frowned. Where were the girls from the night before? I supposed I must have missed it when they left. Maybe they took a cab. Or maybe they were sleeping in. It was only 7:30 a.m. After all, and they'd been up late. I rubbed my eyes. I really wished that I'd been able to sleep, but at this point I was used to the disappointment. I looked out the window at my neighbor's still house. Morning fog sat heavy over the houses on the street. All the curtains were still drawn, at least on the front-facing windows. I drank coffee facing the house across the street, but by the time evening rolled around, my neighbor had returned home and nobody had left. Initially, I shrugged it off. It was possible I'd missed it anyway, and I didn't really care about my neighbor enough to investigate further. It was a few nights later, however, when I noticed it happening again. This time, it was a man wearing a t-shirt and bedazzled jeans. They seemed to be laughing about something. My neighbor once again led him to the front door, and they retreated inside. The curtains remained drawn. I kept an eye on the house again, in my hazy insomniac state, but again did not see the man leave. Was this cause for alarm, I wondered? Surely the guests were leaving, and I was just missing it. Every night from then on was the same. My neighbor escorted scantily clad guests, sometimes women, sometimes men, sometimes both, or more than one into his home, and kept the curtains shut. I never saw anyone leave. I began to question my sanity. I had considered contacting the police, but had absolutely no proof that my neighbor was doing anything wrong. Plus, the word of a frazzled insomniac was probably not one to take very seriously. I could barely take myself seriously. Even so, I watched every night. I lost count of how many he'd now brought home, but I'd guess it was nearing 30. He was a busy man. It came to the point where I sat crouched at my living room window, staring out across the street illuminated by the street lamps. Every night without fail, at around 3 a.m., my neighbor pulled into his driveway and brought home more guests. It was a whole month later, and I still hadn't seen any of them leave. I tried to see what he was up to, but his curtains stubbornly remained closed. I could often see a faint glow from behind them, suggesting that there was a light on somewhere in the house. But I could see no silhouettes. The only time I saw his guests was between his car and his front door. Eventually, it began driving me crazy. If I wasn't sleeping before, I sure as hell wasn't now. I began to devise a plan. I knew that my neighbor was often gone all day until late at night. So at 9 p.m., once it was dark, I snuck across the street, hunched over. Like some kind of amateur investigator, I wore a black sweatshirt with the hood pulled over my head. I crept to the edge of his lawn, keeping an eye out for any other neighbors or passers-by, but saw no one. I moved to the corner of the house, trying to see in through the window, but to no avail. I decided to move to the back of the house to see if I could get a better look. I hopped a small fence and faced the house. It was very dark back there, the street lights barely reaching it, and there were no lights on inside the house. No matter, I had prepared for this. I pulled a small flashlight out of my pocket and flicked it on. I shined it at the quiet house. It seemed most of the blinds were closed on the back side of the house as well, I saw with disappointment. But maybe I could still find something. I approached the back door carefully and shined my light at it. I was happy to see that there was no curtain on the door's window. I got closer, basically pressing my nose against the glass. I could only see an empty hallway and the living room beyond that. There was no movement. I was about to give up when my flashlight caught the glimmer of something in my neighbor's living room. Behind the couch, I squinted and quickly realized it was a single high-heeled shoe adorned with crystals. Who would leave a shoe? Another article of clothing, perhaps a jacket, was plausible, but a shoe. You wouldn't get far without realizing it was gone. I shined my light around the hallway, hoping for another piece of the puzzle, but was unable to see anything. Almost without thinking about it, I put my hand on the doorknob. To my shock, it was unlocked. I hesitated. I could get in real trouble for this. I could go to jail. This was breaking and entering, or maybe just entering. At the very least, I was already trespassing. I opened the door anyway. I entered the house, noticing it felt oddly cold for this time of year. I tiptoed down the hallway, feeling rather thrilled. I'd never broken the law before, unless you counted smoking weed in high school. I went to the living room and looked at the shoe up close. It seemed it had been tossed aside, perhaps in a passionate way. I moved to the kitchen, but found nothing suspicious there. My neighbor's house was oddly clean. I headed upstairs to the bedrooms, still trying to be as cautious as I could. The first bedroom, his bedroom, I assumed, was tidy. His clothes were neatly folded, and his bed was made. I saw no signs of another person. The shoe downstairs was really the only proof I had of the people I'd seen, until I reached the spare room. It felt even colder than the other rooms when I entered it, and I shivered. At first, it seemed fairly ordinary, a simple storage room. But when I approached one of the shelves, I recognized a sequin top, and bedazzled jeans, and many other articles of clothing that I recognized. A large jug of some sort of dark liquid stood on one of the shelves, along with several books in languages I did not understand. I saw a hammer leaned against the craft table. I gasped softly. What did this mean? Was he killing them, or what? It was then that I heard a car pull into the driveway. My heart nearly jumped out of my chest. What should I do? Run? Could I run without him seeing me? I switched off my flashlight and peeked outside. I could see that he was in the driveway, chatting with some other doomed guest. I rushed down the stairs and headed for the back door. I had just closed it behind me when I heard the front door open. I crouched down, panting heavily. I could hear their muffled voices talking. I quickly went around the side of the house to go back over the fence, now thankful the blinds were closed. I stumbled over some fresh dirt, but didn't dare turn back to find out if it was a garden or something more sinister. I leapt over the fence and ran full out back to my house. I didn't look back at my neighbor's house until I had locked my own door behind me. I went to my living room and watched his house, adrenaline pumping through me. I could see a light was on now, and I wondered what he was doing. I couldn't be sure, but I had a feeling this guest would not be leaving in the morning. Night after night, I watched the neighbor's house, and the endless stream of men and women he brings home. I still consider calling the police. I might do it and claim I saw something from my house, or heard something. I can't help but wonder, would they come back out after they searched the house? I think I may have been lucky in my escape. I was able to leave. I think my neighbor's other guests are not so fortunate. Had some neighbors with 2 young teenage boys. These boys would hang out with my brothers, sometimes often. They were of a particular religion that didn't like for them to have smartphones or video games and stuff. So when they came over they wanted to play on the Wii Mom. Wouldn't really let them though to honor their parents' wishes. Anyway, the younger brother was really sweet, fun to be with, and used crutches. We loved having him over because he was a really good friend to my youngest brother. The older brother has since been described as a creepy man-child. We found him spying on us from the tall grass and weeds in front of our yard. He borrowed some binoculars and didn't really want to give them back when confronted about it. You could kind of see our house from his, but it was a little way away, so we assumed he used our binoculars to watch us and the girls from the family in the house right next to ours. He eventually built a weird shed that was on public property, the little alley between our houses' rural country, which we again thought he went in to watch the other neighbors. After misusing or even breaking a few of our belongings and throwing rocks at our dog, he eventually hit my younger brother. He was no longer welcome. His little brother was though. They moved recently, and we have some really awesome neighbors now. It absolutely has to be my great uncle. There have been times over my childhood when he, his parents, and his sister would live near us. All were on disability or social security and would pool their money together to afford rent, groceries, and bills. They also would move around a lot, and sometimes they wound up living near us. He was hit by a car as a kid and has problems, but he's not as bad as he was made out to be. He's quite the sociopath, he's manipulative, and he's paranoid. He gets away with a lot and knows how to work people. He also has to drive by several times a day and calls several times a day to check in. Everyone has to be where they're supposed to be or he just loses it. When I was a kid, we lived in this brick house in the city. In one of their many moves, they moved 2 houses down from us. He would call and say, "You cooking chicken?" because he could smell it at their house. Or he'd drive up in a hurry and beat on the front door because I heard the dog barking, everything okay. Shortly after those incidents, we moved to the country. The driving by stopped, but the calls were constant. My parents split up when I was a teenager, so Mom and us kids moved back to the city. The driving by continued, and at one point they lived at the opposite end of the street as we did. If he heard sirens, he'd come our way beating on the door, demanding to see everyone to make sure we were all still alive. Over the years, my grandmother and their parents have passed away. We currently live behind a factory next to a trailer park. He has lived in 4 of the 9 or 10 trailers in the park. The one he currently lives in can see right at our back door. He's always hanging out the window watching us, especially if he hears us in the backyard. He uses our trash can because people are spying on him and looking through his garbage, so he doesn't have a trash can. He used to look into our mailbox. He'll pound on the back window, not the window, until you answer the door, and unless the storm door is locked, he'll shove you aside and barge in. I've begged my mom to get away from him for years, to get out of his town for years, but she's one of those but family types. I had a next-door neighbor who never said hello or even made eye contact. I think he was a hitman because he'd leave at night with a case similar to a viola case. I doubt he was a musician. One night I heard a major argument and pounding in the unit downstairs, so I called the police. They showed up and mistakenly knocked on the door of my next-door neighbor. He was there. He would not open the door no matter how much they knocked. I figured he was probably sitting in the dark with a rifle pointing at the door. I directed the cops to the unit downstairs. I'll never know what that guy was up to. Family we lived next door to. Their son developed a brain tumor when he was about 19. He became pretty reclusive, and unfortunately the tumor began causing some alarming aggressive, unpredictable behavior. We could hear him screaming at night and things. One of my brothers and his friends were camping in the back garden one night and heard someone outside. My brother's friend unzipped the bottom of the tent and could see a pair of shoes right outside and hear heavy breathing. My older brother incredibly happened to be passing and saw the guy go into the garden. It was the brain tumor kid. My older brother chased him, but like all things with my family, it just was never spoken about again. Sadly, the guy died not long after that. No idea what his intentions were. I always found that story horrifying when I was a child. I was about 8 and asleep upstairs. When I was really little, my next-door neighbor moved away and began renting his house out. Most of his tenants didn't stay longer than a year or two, and a lot of them were really cool people. Hell, I'm still in touch with the kids of one of them. And the younger of the kids is turning 40 this year, but there were a couple of real oddballs and even a few assholes. One of the oddballs was a guy with no furniture. I'm not even sure where he slept, because he had no furniture in the house, and my mom and I used to joke that it was because he was on the run and needed to travel light. Turns out we were right. One day, we saw men in dark suits peering over his fence. Shortly after that, he broke his lease and vanished. Then the men in dark suits knocked on our door and asked if we knew where he could have gone. They were the IRS, and the guy had been evading his taxes for years.
Thanks for listening. If you like our work, do subscribe because your support helps us keep this channel alive.